This is not your conversation anymore, Rhett said, and the diner went dead silent. Darren Cole froze mid-sentence, his hand still raised near Lena's shoulder. Humiliation caught in his throat like a bone. Lena stood frozen too, a tray trembling in her hands, eyes wide with disbelief that anyone had finally noticed the bruises she worked so hard to hide. If you've ever watched someone suffer in silence and wished you could do something about it, stay with me till the end of this story and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see how far this story has traveled. Lena Harper had learned a long time ago that silence was survival. She learned it the way a person learns to walk on ice, carefully, quietly testing every step before putting her full weight down. In the diner off Route 9 in a town called Harris Valley, where the gas station and the church and the feed store were the only things that mattered, Lena moved through her shifts like a woman crossing a frozen lake, never quite sure when the surface would crack beneath her. The bruise on her cheekbone that morning is 3 days old, yellowing at the edges, and she had learned exactly how much foundation covered it and exactly how much didn't. She'd learned it the way she'd learned which booth needed extra napkins and which regular liked his coffee black with 2 sugars on the side, never mixed in. Small mercies, small precisions, a life measured out in careful, silent adjustments. "Order up," called Marta from the kitchen window, sliding 2 plates of eggs and bacon onto the pass, and Lena moved toward them the way she moved toward everything now, fast, efficient, invisible. She was 29 years old, though the exhaustion behind her eyes made her look older, and she had worked at Cole's Diner for 4 years, which was 3 years and 8 months longer than she should have stayed. She knew that. She'd known it for a long time. Knowing it and being able to do anything about it were 2 very different things, and the gap between them was where Lena Harper had built her entire life. Darren Cole owned the diner, and Darren Cole owned in his mind everyone who worked in it. He was a big man, not tall so much as wide, with the kind of face that could look friendly to strangers and look like a closing door to anyone who worked for him. He wore a name tag that said manager, even though it was his name on the deed, because he liked the word. He liked the sound of it. He liked saying it. "Lena," his voice cut across the diner floor that morning, sharp enough that 2 customers at the counter glanced up. "Table 6 needed their check 5 minutes ago. You want to explain to me why you're standing there, staring into space instead of doing your job?" "Sorry, Darren, I'm on it. Sorry doesn't refill nobody's coffee." He said it loud the way he always did, making sure the words carried to the corners of the room, making sure everyone heard him correct her. "You're lucky I keep you around. You know that girls like you don't exactly have people lining up to hire them." Lena didn't answer. She'd learned that answering only gave him more to work with. She grabbed the check from the register and carried it to table 6, where an elderly couple sat finishing their pancakes, and she smiled at them. The practiced smile she'd perfected over 4 years, the one that didn't reach her eyes but fooled almost everyone who wasn't looking closely. "Here you go, folks. Y'all have a good morning." "You too, sweetheart," the old woman said, patting Lena's hand, and for just a moment, one small, fragile moment, Lena felt something crack open in her chest, some old ache that had nothing to do with bruises and everything to do with being spoken to like a person instead of a problem. Then Darren's voice cracked across the diner again, and the moment closed. "Table 6, are we having a party over there, or are you going to get back to work?" She got back to work. It was 9:40 in the morning when the sound started, a low rumble, distant at first like weather rolling in from somewhere far off. Lena barely registered it. Trucks passed on Route 9 all the time, big rigs, hauling freight through the valley, and she had long ago trained herself to filter out the sounds of the world outside the diner's windows, because the world outside wasn't where her attention was allowed to go. But the rumble grew. It didn't fade the way a passing truck would fade. It got louder and it multiplied until it wasn't one sound anymore, but dozens layered on top of each other, a rolling wall of engine noise that made the coffee cups on the counter tremble faintly against their saucers. Marta stuck her head out from the kitchen window, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lord," she said, "what is that?" Lena walked to the window, and what she saw made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't fully understand yet. Motorcycles, dozens of them riding in tight formation down Route 9 Chrome, catching the morning sun, leather vests marked with patches that even from this distance she could read the shape of the winged skull, the colors, the unmistakable insignia of the Hells Angels. They rolled into the diner's gravel lot in a slow, deliberate procession, engines idling down one by one, until the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. Darren came out from behind the register, and for the first time that morning, Lena saw something on his face that wasn't quite his usual mask of casual cruelty. It was calculation. Fear dressed up as calculation. "Everybody stay calm," he said mostly to himself. "They're just customers. Money's money." The bell above the door rang and rang again and again as they filed in, big men, weathered men with the kind of stillness in their eyes that told you they'd seen things most people in Harris Valley that never would. The diner, which normally held maybe 15 customers, comfortably filled up fast boots on tile leather, creaking low voices, exchanging words Lena couldn't quite catch. And then he walked in. She didn't know his name yet. She wouldn't know it for another hour, but she noticed him the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm, some old animal instinct in her chest sitting up straight and paying attention. He was tall, broad through the shoulders with a gray beard trimmed close and gray hair pulled back, and he moved through the noise of his own crew like a stone in a river, the water bending around him instead of the other way. He didn't sit at the counter with the others. He took a booth by himself near the window, and when Lena approached with her order pad and her practiced smile, he looked up at her, and something in his gaze made the smile falter for just a fraction of a second before she caught it and pulled it back into place. "Morning," she said. "What can I get you? Coffee, black?" His voice was low and hurried. "And whatever's good today." "Biscuits and gravy's good. Marta makes it fresh." "That'll do." She wrote it down, though she didn't need to, and turned to walk away, and that was when she felt his eyes still on her. Not in the way men sometimes looked at her. Not that kind of attention, but something else. Something that felt unsettlingly like being seen. The next hour unfolded the way most hours at Cole's Diner unfolded, except that it didn't. Not really, because there was a current running underneath everything now, a tension Lena couldn't name, but could feel in her spine every time she crossed the floor. Darren, emboldened perhaps by the cash the bikers were spending, or perhaps simply because cruelty was a habit he couldn't break, even under new eyes, found reasons to needle her. He always found reasons. "Table 9 wants their check redone. You wrote the total wrong," he said. Though she hadn't. She redid it anyway. "You're moving too slow. We got a full house in case you didn't notice." "That coffee's cold. Take it back." Each correction landed a little louder than it needed to, a little more public than it needed to be. And each time Lena felt the eyes of the room shift toward her for a half second before shifting away again the way people's eyes always did, noticing and then choosing not to notice, because noticing meant involvement and involvement meant risk. Except one set of eyes didn't shift away. The man in the booth by the window watched every single interaction. He didn't turn his head sharply or make it obvious. He simply watched over the rim of his coffee cup while his food went half-eaten in front of him, tracking the way Lena's shoulders curled inward every time Darren's voice rose, tracking the half-second flinch that crossed her face when Darren's hand landed too heavily on her shoulder as he pushed past her toward the register. Around 11, during a lull, he waved her over, not with his hand, just a small tilt of his chin, and she came because that was her job, because saying no to a customer wasn't a thing she was allowed to do, even if some deep tired part of her wanted to. "Refill?" she asked, holding up the pot. "Please." He let her pour, then said without any particular weight to it, like he was asking about the weather, "You all right?" The question landed strangely. Nobody asked her that. Not really. Not in a way that expected an honest answer. "I'm fine," she said in the way she always said it, the two words worn smooth from overuse like a stone rubbed soft by a river. He looked at her for a moment longer than the answer warranted. His eyes were pale gray-blue, and there was nothing threatening in them, which somehow made them harder to hold than if there had been. "All right," he said finally, and let her go. But she felt it as she walked away, the sense that he hadn't believed her, not for a second, and that unlike everyone else in Harris Valley who had learned to accept her lies about being fine, this man had simply filed the lie away the way you'd note the location of an exit in an unfamiliar building. She didn't know yet that his name was Rhett Malone. She didn't know that the men who rode with him called him Rex, not because he demanded it, but because it was the kind of name that attached itself to men who didn't have to raise their voice to be obeyed. She didn't know that in the world he came from, silence, like his wasn't passivity, it was the loudest thing in the room. All she knew was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked at her and seen through the fine. The lunch rush hit like it always did, a wall of hunger and impatience rolling through the door in waves, And Lena threw herself into the work the way she always did because work was the only thing that made the hours pass without her having to think too hard about the life she was living inside of. It was during this rush that the first real crack appeared. Darren, moving fast behind the counter, reached across her to grab a pot of coffee at the exact moment she was reaching for the same pot, and their hands collided and the pot tipped, and scalding coffee splashed across the counter and across the edge of her wrist. She gasped more from surprise than pain and jerked backward, and in doing so knocked a tray of plates from the counter's edge. The plates shattered against the tile in a sound like a small explosion. Gravy and eggs and broken ceramic scattering across the floor, and the diner for one suspended second went completely silent. Then Darren's face went red. "Are you kidding me?" His voice wasn't loud yet, but it had the particular quality of a voice about to become loud, a held breath before a shout. "Do you know how much that just cost me? Do you have any idea? It was an accident, Darren. You bumped my—" "Don't." He pointed a thick finger at her close enough that she instinctively stepped back. "Don't you dare try to make this my fault. You're the one holding the tray. You're always the one who can't keep her head straight. You know that I don't know why I keep you on." Every conversation in the diner had stopped. Forks hovered over plates. The bikers at the counter had gone quiet too, though quiet in a different register than the rest of the room. Not embarrassed silence, but watchful silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a decision. Lena crouched down, scalded wrist forgotten, and began gathering broken plates with shaking hands, murmuring apologies that nobody had asked for and everybody could hear. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up right now. I'm sorry, Darren. You're sorry." He laughed short and ugly. "You're always sorry. Sorry doesn't pay for broken dishes. Sorry doesn't run this place. I swear sometimes I wonder if you even want to keep this job, way you carry on." "I want to keep it. I do. I'm sorry. I'll pay for the pays. Damn right you'll pay for them." It was in this moment Lena on her knees on the diner floor, gravy soaking into the fabric of her uniform pants, voice cracking with an apology she shouldn't have had to give, that the booth by the window went still, in an entirely different way. Rhett Malone set down his coffee cup. He didn't slam it. He didn't make a scene of the gesture. He simply set it down with a soft, deliberate click against the table and stood, and the sound of that single cup meeting that single table seemed in the frozen silence of the diner louder than the plates had been when they shattered. Darren didn't notice at first. He was too busy standing over Lena, watching her clean up a mess that was half his fault, still muttering about the cost of dishes and the cost of carelessness, and the cost always of keeping her around. "You'd think after 4 years you'd learn to be careful," he was saying. "You'd think that's enough." The voice wasn't loud. That was the strange thing about it. The thing that made every head in the diner turn, it wasn't loud at all. It was calm, even unhurried, the voice of a man remarking on the weather. But it carried the way certain voices carry, not through volume, but through the sheer certainty behind them, and Darren's head snapped up like he'd been struck. Rhett was standing now fully upright, and for the first time Lena, still crouched on the floor with a broken plate in her hand, understood the true size of him. He wasn't just tall, he filled space in a way that made the diner feel smaller, made Darren, who had always seemed so large and immovable behind his counter, suddenly seem like exactly what he was, a man playing at power in a small room who had never in his life stood in front of someone who actually possessed it. "Excuse me," Darren said, and there was an attempt at his usual authority in the words, but it wavered just slightly like a flag losing wind. "I said that's enough." Rhett walked toward the counter, slow, unbothered hands loose at his sides. "She dropped a tray. It happens. It's not a crime, and it sure as hell doesn't earn a grown man screaming at a woman on her knees in front of a room full of people. This is my diner. I'll talk to my employees however I didn't ask whose diner it was." Rhett's tone didn't rise even a fraction. "I said that's enough." The room had gone so silent that Lena could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the drip of coffee still falling from the edge of the counter where the pot had spilled, could hear distantly one of the other bikers shift his weight on his stool, a small creak of leather that seemed enormous in the quiet. Darren's jaw worked. He looked around the room at his customers, at the row of leather-clad men watching him with expressions he couldn't read, at Marta frozen in the kitchen window, at Lena still on the floor. wrist reddening from the coffee, burn eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear of what might happen next. Because in her experience, moments like this never ended well for her. "You don't know anything about this," Darren said, quieter now, some of the bluster draining out of him. "This is between me and my employee." "No." Rhett's eyes didn't waver. "This is between a man twice her size screaming at a woman for an accident in front of a room full of people who are all sitting here pretending they don't see what's happening. That's what this is." Nobody in the diner spoke. Lena felt her face go hot with a strange, complicated mixture of humiliation and something else, something she didn't have a name for yet, something that felt dangerously close to hope. And hope, she'd learned a long time ago, was a luxury she couldn't afford because hope was what made the falling hurt worse. Darren looked like he wanted to say something else, wanted to reclaim the room, reclaim his authority, but something in Rhett's stillness, the absolute immovable calm of him, seemed to steal the words right out of his throat. "Fine," Darren finally muttered. "Fine, whatever." He turned to Lena, and for a moment there was something almost like restraint in his voice, though the anger still simmered underneath it. "Clean this up. We'll talk about it later." He walked away back toward the register, shoulders stiff, and the diner exhaled as one collective breath, conversation slowly resuming in low murmurs, forks lifting again, the ordinary noise of a diner, reasserting itself over the wreckage of what had just happened. But Rhett didn't sit back down. He crouched instead right there on the diner floor across from Lena and began picking up pieces of broken plate alongside of his big weathered hands, moving with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous with their size. "You don't have to do that," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the register where Darren stood with his back to them, radio crackling as he pretended to check inventory. "I know I don't have to," Rhett set a shard of ceramic onto the growing pile between them. "Doing it anyway. He's going to say something about you helping. He doesn't let him." She looked up at him, then really looked, and found none of the pity in his face that she'd half expected, none of the performative concern that sometimes came from strangers who wanted credit for noticing a woman's pain without actually doing anything about it. What she found instead was something quieter. Attention. The kind of attention that didn't ask anything of her, didn't demand she perform gratitude or explain herself or pretend the moment hadn't happened. "Thank you," she said so softly it was almost swallowed by the diner's noise, "for what you said. Nobody's ever—" She stopped herself, throat tightening around words she hadn't meant to let loose. "Nobody's ever what?" She shook her head, gathering the last of the broken plate into her apron. "Nothing. It's nothing. I need to get back to work before he—" "Before he what?" The question hung there, gentle but unrelenting, and Lena felt the careful architecture of her silence trembling under the weight of it. 4 years of practiced deflection, 4 years of "I'm fine and it's nothing and don't worry about it," and this stranger with the gray beard and the pale eyes was dismantling it with nothing but 2 words and the patience to wait for her answer. "Before he gets angrier," she finally admitted, so quiet it was barely sound at all. "It's easier if I just don't give him reasons." Something shifted behind Rhett's eyes, something that Lena in her exhaustion and her fear couldn't quite name, but that felt unmistakably like a decision being made. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "I have to get back to work." Lena. It was the first time he'd used her name, and she startled slightly, wondering when he'd learned it from her name tag. She realized a beat later, small silver letters pinned crooked to her uniform, that she hadn't thought anyone bothered to read. "How long?" "Please," she whispered, standing quickly, apron full of broken ceramic wrists throbbing where the coffee had burned it. "Please don't. It's not, you don't understand how this works. If he thinks I'm talking about him, if he thinks I said something to anyone, it gets worse. It always gets worse." Rhett stood too unhurried, and for a moment the two of them faced each other in the small space beside the counter, the diner's noise a distant hum around them. "Nobody's going to make it worse for you," he said. "Not while I'm standing here. You won't always be standing here." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with a bitterness that surprised her. "You'll finish your coffee, and you'll ride off with your friends, and tomorrow this will still be my life. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." She expected him to argue. Most people, when confronted with the truth of a situation they couldn't fix, either argued their way past it or retreated from it, entirely uncomfortable with a problem that couldn't be solved with a single grand gesture. Rhett did neither. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his pale eyes, and said, maybe, or maybe not. Then he walked back to his booth and sat down, and Lena carried the broken plates to the trash, and the diner continued its ordinary churn of orders and coffee refills, and the low murmur of conversation. As if the last 5 minutes hadn't cracked something open in the walls Lena Harper had spent 4 years building around herself. But cracks, once they appear, have a way of spreading. The rest of the lunch rush passed in a blur of orders and burns, and the low simmering tension of Darren's anger, which hadn't disappeared so much as gone underground, waiting for an opportunity to resurface, without an audience of leather-clad witnesses. Lena felt it every time she passed him, the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes tracked her movements with a coldness that promised a reckoning later once the diner had cleared out and it was just the two of them and the empty tables. She'd felt that coldness before. She knew exactly what it meant. Around 1:30, the crowd began to thin, bikers finishing their meals in 2s and 3s boots, scraping against tile as they rose and drifted toward the door engines starting up outside, in a rolling chorus that built and then gradually faded as they pulled out of the lot one by one. Lena watched through the window, half of her, hoping the man in the booth by the window would leave with them, would take his unsettling attention and his dangerous questions and disappear back into the world he'd rolled in from, and half of her, the half she didn't want to examine too closely, hoping he wouldn't. He didn't leave with the others. He sat at his booth long after his coffee had gone cold, long after his plate had been cleared, watching the diner empty out around him, with the patience of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. Darren noticed this too, and it seemed to unsettle him more than anything else that had happened that day, the presence of a witness who refused to leave. "You need anything else?" Darren asked, eventually forcing something like his customer service voice back into his tone, though it came out strained. "We're going to be doing some cleaning soon, closing up the back section." "I'm fine where I am," Rhett said, not looking up from the cup he was turning slowly between his hands. "Take your time." Darren's smile tightened at the corners. He glanced toward Lena, who was wiping down an empty booth 2 tables away, and something passed across his face, a recalculation. Lena thought a man reassessing whether his usual methods were safe to deploy with an audience still present, however small that audience had become. He chose caution for now. "Lena," he called, voice clipped but controlled. "Once you're done with that, go ahead and restock the coffee station. We're running low on filters." "Okay." She moved to the coffee station, aware of Rhett's eyes on her from across the room, aware in a way she hadn't been aware of anything in years. The strange sensation of being watched, not with suspicion or hunger, or the low-grade threat she'd grown used to from men, but with something that felt disturbingly like concern. It was nearly 2 o'clock when Rhett finally rose from his booth, dropping a stack of bills on the table that Lena would later discover was nearly 3 times what his meal had cost. He walked toward the door, and Lena, restocking napkin dispensers near the register, felt her chest tighten with something she couldn't name relief. Maybe that the tension of his presence was finally leaving, or something closer to loss. The strange ache of watching a door close on a possibility she hadn't let herself fully imagine. But he didn't walk out the door. He stopped at the counter instead, in front of Darren, who straightened up with the practiced smile of a man dealing with a difficult customer he was eager to see gone. "Everything all right?" Darren asked. "Hope the trouble earlier didn't spoil your meal." "Meal was fine." Rhett's voice was as calm as it had been all day, but there was something underneath it now, something with more weight. "I want to ask you something." "Sure, go ahead." "You got a waitress used to work here, Beth Sutter." The name landed in the diner like a stone dropped into still water. Lena, near the register, felt her hands freeze around the napkin dispenser. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in almost 2 years, not since Beth had simply stopped showing up one day. Her apartment emptied out within a week. No forwarding address, no goodbye, nothing but silence where a person used to be. Darren's face changed, just slightly, just enough. "Beth," his voice had a careful lightness to it now, a lightness Lena recognized immediately as the sound of a lie being constructed in real time. "Yeah, she worked here a while back. Quit, suddenly moved on. Girls come and go in this business. You know how it is." "That's so." Rhett's eyes held Darren's without blinking. "Funny thing, I asked around town a little. Nobody seems to know exactly where she moved on to. I couldn't tell you. Wasn't my business to keep track of her after she left." "No," Rhett said slowly. I don't suppose it was. He turned then without another word and walked toward the door, the bell ringing softly above him as he stepped out into the gravel lot. And Lena watched through the window as he swung a leg over his motorcycle, started the engine with a low, deep rumble, and rode away down Route 9 without looking back. The diner felt strangely hollow once he'd gone. The ordinary sounds of the place, the hum of the refrigerator, the drip of the coffee machine, the distant clatter of Marta washing dishes suddenly loud in a way they hadn't been all day, as though the entire building had been holding its breath in his presence, and only now remembered how to exhale. Darren stood very still behind the counter for a long moment, staring at the door, and when he finally turned around, whatever careful control he'd maintained while Rhett was in the room had evaporated entirely. His face was flushed dark with an anger that had been building all day dammed up, and now, with the witness gone, finally free to break loose. "Lena!" His voice was low, tight, and far more frightening than his earlier shouting had been. "Come here." She felt her whole body go cold. "Darren, I need to finish the now." She set down the napkin dispenser with hands that had begun very slightly to shake and walked toward him every step, an exercise in the careful math she'd been performing for 4 years. How close could she get without being close enough to grab? How much space could she leave without seeming defiant? How quickly could she apologize before the apology itself became the thing that angered him? "You think that's cute?" Darren's voice dropped even lower, a hiss more than a sentence. "You think it's cute letting some biker trash embarrass me in front of my own diner? You think that makes you safe?" I didn't say anything to him, Darren. I swear he asked about Beth. Darren's eyes were hard now, flat, the eyes of a man doing calculations he didn't want anyone else to see. "Somebody's been running their mouth. You know anything about that?" No, I promise I never said a word about her. I don't even..." "You better not have." He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that every instinct in her body screamed at her to step back, even as she forced herself to stay still, because stepping back always made it worse, always looked like guilt, always gave him an excuse. "Because if I find out you've been talking to anybody about anything that happens in this diner, you're going to regret it in ways you can't even imagine. You understand me?" "I understand." "Do you..." His hand came up, not quite a slap, not yet, just a hard press of fingers against her jaw, tilting her face up to meet his. And she felt the old familiar terror flood through her, the specific terror of a body that had learned exactly what came next in moments like this one. "Because I've been real patient with you, Lena, real patient. But patience runs out." "I understand, Darren, I do, I'm sorry." He held her there a moment longer, some silent test of her fear, and then released her jaw with a small shove that sent her stumbling back half a step. "Get back to work," he said, already turning away, voice returning to its ordinary register as though nothing at all had happened. "And don't think I don't know you're grateful to that trash for embarrassing me. Don't think I don't see it on your face." Lena stood very still, one hand pressed lightly to her jaw, where his fingers had dug in, watching him walk toward the back office, and she felt something inside her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not just fear, though the fear was still there, thick and familiar as an old coat. Something else underneath it, something sharp and small and dangerous. Anger. Not at Rhett for asking the question that had triggered this, not even fully at herself for the 4 years of silence that had brought her to this exact moment. The anger when she let herself feel it fully for just a second before burying it back down where it was safe was aimed squarely and completely at Darren Cole, and at every version of this exact scene that had played out in this diner for 4 long years, and at the terrible aching question that Rhett's presence had cracked open inside her, without either of them fully realizing it yet. What had actually happened to Beth Sutter, she didn't know. She told herself for 2 years that she didn't want to know, that some things were safer left unexamined, that a woman who couldn't even protect herself had no business digging into the disappearance of someone else. But the question sat there now, lodged in her chest like a splinter, refusing to be ignored the way it had been ignored for 2 years. The rest of her shift passed in a fog. She refilled coffee cups and cleared plates and wiped down tables with the mechanical efficiency of 4 years of practice. But underneath the surface of her movements, something had shifted, some tectonic plate in the architecture of her life, beginning almost imperceptibly to move. At 6 o'clock, her shift finally ended, and she walked out into the parking lot where her old sedan sat in its usual spot near the back fence, and she was fumbling for her keys when she saw it, a small folded piece of paper tucked beneath her windshield wiper. The kind of thing that might have been an advertisement or a parking notice, if not for the fact that it was handwritten block letters pressed firm into the paper. She pulled it free with trembling fingers and unfolded it there in the gravel lot, the evening light beginning to slant gold and long across the valley. In case you need. The number below it was written clean and simple, no name attached, though she didn't need a name to know exactly whose handwriting this was, exactly whose voice she could hear saying the words if she closed her eyes. She stood there for the long moment, the note trembling slightly in her hand, the weight of the entire day pressing down on her, the humiliation, the burn on her wrist, the fresh bruise already forming where Darren's fingers had dug into her jaw, and underneath all of it, this strange, unfamiliar thing, a piece of paper with a phone number on it, an offer of something she didn't have a name for yet, extended by a stranger who had walked into her life for exactly one lunch shift and had somehow seen more of her truth than anyone else had bothered to see in 4 long years. She folded the note carefully and slid it into her pocket, and she didn't call it that night, though her fingers hovered over her phone more than once in the quiet dark of her small apartment, the weight of Darren's threats still fresh in her mind, the old fear still whispering that reaching out to anyone at all was the single most dangerous thing she could do. But she didn't throw the note away either. And that, though she didn't fully understand it yet, was the first small crack in 4 years of silence. Not the calling, not yet, but the simple, quiet decision to keep the number. Instead of destroying it, to let the possibility exist, instead of extinguishing it, the way she'd extinguished every other possibility of escape that had ever crossed her path. Somewhere across the valley, Rhett Malone sat on the porch of a rented room above a hardware store, phone in his hand, scrolling through what little information he'd managed to gather in a single afternoon of careful questions asked to careful people. Beth Sutter, 26 years old, worked at Cole's Diner for 2 years before vanishing without a trace, no family in the area, no forwarding address, nothing but an empty apartment and a landlord who remembered her as quiet, hardworking, and afraid of something she'd never named. He set the phone down on the porch railing and looked out over the darkening valley toward the diner's neon sign glowing faintly in the distance, and he thought about a woman on her knees on a diner floor, apologizing for a mess that wasn't her fault, and the particular practiced way she'd said, "I'm fine," the way that phrase had come out of her like a reflex worn smooth by years of repetition. He'd seen women say that phrase before. He'd learned a long time ago in a different life, before the vest and the patches and the Brotherhood that had rebuilt him after everything else had fallen apart, exactly what that phrase meant when it came out that smoothly, that automatically. It meant the opposite of fine. It always did. He didn't know yet what he was going to do about it. He didn't know if the folded note under her windshield wiper would ever amount to anything more than a piece of paper thrown away in a moment of fear, or if it would become the first thread in something larger, something that might finally answer the question of what had happened to a young woman named Beth Sutter 2 years ago, and what might happen to Lena Harper if nobody intervened. But he knew he wasn't leaving Harris Valley. Not yet. Not with that question still hanging in the air unanswered, and not with the memory of a woman's flinch every time a man's hand came too close to her shoulder. Some things once seen couldn't be unseen. And Rhett Malone had seen enough. The note stayed in her pocket for 3 days. Lena carried it through every shift like a coal. She couldn't decide whether to hold on to or drop, feeling its presence against her hip every time she reached for a coffee pot, every time Darren's voice cracked across the diner floor, every time she caught herself glancing toward the window, as if a line of motorcycles might come rolling back down Route 9 just because she needed them to. They didn't come back. Not on the first day, not on the second. By the 3rd day, she had almost convinced herself the whole thing had been some strange fever dream, brought on by exhaustion and a scalded wrist, a stranger's kindness that couldn't possibly have been real, because nothing that good had ever been real in her life before, not without a cost attached to it somewhere down the line. Then Darren found the note. It happened on a Thursday during the dead hour after lunch when the diner emptied out, and the only sounds were the hum of the ice machine and Marta scrubbing the grill in the back. Lena had hung her jacket on the hook by the employee bathroom, the way she always did, and she hadn't thought about the fact that the note had slipped from her pocket that morning while she was pulling out her keys, hadn't thought about the fact that it now sat folded and unremarkable. On the floor beneath her jacket, where anyone might see it, Darren saw it. "What's this?" His voice came from behind her too close, and Lena turned to find him holding the small, folded paper between 2 thick fingers, already unfolding it before she could reach for it, his eyes scanning the block, letters, and the phone number beneath them. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. "That's nothing," she said too fast, reaching for it. It's an old note. It doesn't matter. Can I have it back? In case you need." Darren read the words aloud, slow savoring them, the way a man savors a piece of evidence he's been waiting for. "Where'd you get this, Lena?" "I don't remember. It's nothing, Darren, please. It's just, don't lie to me." His voice dropped into that register she'd learned to fear more than shouting, quiet and coiled impatient. "This is from him, isn't it? The biker. The one that made a fool of me in front of my own customers." "No, Darren, I swear I don't even—" "You don't even— what?" He stepped closer and she stepped back and her shoulders hit the wall beside the employee lockers and there was nowhere left to go. "You've been talking to him, behind my back, after everything I told you." "I haven't talked to him at all. He just left it. I never asked for it. I never even looked at his number. I swear to you." "You're lying." He crumpled the note in his fist, and something about that small violence, the paper crushing in his hand, the ink smearing where his fingers dug into it, made Lena's breath catch in her throat. "You've been planning something. Is that it? You think some outlaw biker is going to ride in here and be your knight in shining armor? Is that the fantasy you've been running in that head of yours? That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" She didn't have an answer that would satisfy him. There was no answer that would satisfy him, not anymore, not with the note crumpled in his fist, in his face, inches from hers, in 4 years of careful silence, collapsing in real time in a hallway that smelled like bleach and old coffee grounds. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Darren said, voice dropping even lower, almost gentle now, which was somehow worse than the anger. "Have you called that number?" "No." "Are you going to?" The question hung there, and Lena felt something strange happen inside her chest. Not fear, not exactly though. Fear was still present, still thick in her throat. Something else moved underneath it. A small, hard kernel of resistance she hadn't felt in years, a splinter of the woman she'd been before 4 years of Darren Cole had worn her down into something smaller. "I don't know," she said. It wasn't defiance, not really. It was honesty, plain and unadorned, the first honest thing she'd said to him in longer than she could remember. But to Darren, honesty that didn't bend to his will might as well have been a slap across the face. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, the same wrist, still tender from the coffee burn, 3 days before, and squeezed hard enough that she gasped a sharp involuntary sound that seemed to satisfy something dark and hungry behind his eyes. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "You call that number, you tell that trash anything about what happens in this diner, and I promise you your life gets so much smaller than it already is. You understand I know people. I know how to make problems disappear." The word disappear landed in the small hallway like a dropped weight, and Lena felt her whole body go cold because she understood with a sudden and terrible clarity exactly what he was telling her, exactly what he might have told Beth Sutter 2 years ago in this same hallway, or one just like it. "Are you threatening me?" The words came out before she could stop them, quieter than she meant them to be, but steady. Darren's grip tightened for one more second before he released her wrist, shoving it away from him like something distasteful. "I'm reminding you," he said, "how good you've got it. Now get back to work before I dock your pay for standing around." He walked away, tossing the crumpled note into the trash can by the register as he passed it, and Lena stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, cradling her aching wrist against her chest, staring at the small wadded ball of paper visible through the clear plastic liner of the trash can. She waited until he disappeared into the back office. Then she walked to the trash can, reached in, and pulled the note back out, smoothing the crumpled paper against her apron as best she could. The ink smudged now, but the number still legible. She didn't fully understand in that moment what had changed in her. But something had. Some threshold had been crossed in that hallway. Some old fear finally meeting a resistance it hadn't met in years, and though her hands were still shaking as she slid the note back into her pocket, there was something underneath the shaking, now a decision forming, slowly the way ice forms on still water, invisible until suddenly it wasn't. She called the number that night. Her hands trembled so badly it took her 3 tries to get through all the digits correctly, and when the line finally connected and began to ring, she nearly hung up, nearly threw the phone across her small apartment, and told herself she'd imagined the whole thing, that this was madness, that Darren was right, and she was chasing some fantasy that would only make everything worse. Then the ringing stopped. Yeah. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, low, unhurried, utterly without pretense. It's Lena. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. From the diner. You left me I know who you are. There was no surprise in his voice, only a quiet, steady attention, as though he'd been waiting for this call, without any real certainty it would come, and had made peace with either outcome. You all right? The question again, the same one from the diner, the one that had cracked something open in her 3 days ago. No, she said, and the words surprised her as much as it seemed to land on him, a beat of silence on the line before he spoke again. Tell me what happened. So she did. Haltingly at first, then faster, the whole story spilling out of her in a rush. She couldn't have stopped, even if she'd wanted to, the note Darren finding it, the crumpled paper, the hand around her wrist, the word disappear hanging in the hallway air like smoke that wouldn't clear. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line, long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. He threatened you, Rhett said finally. His voice hadn't risen at all, but something in it had changed, gone flatter, harder, like stone settling into place. He does that. It's not new. It's not supposed to be normal either. A pause. You said he mentioned making problems disappear. Those his exact words. Close to it. Why be when you... Another silence, this one heavier than the last, and when Rhett spoke again, his voice was careful in a way that told Lena he was choosing his words with deliberate precision. Lena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think hard before you answer. Before you started working there, or maybe when you first started, did you ever hear anything about a woman named Beth Sutter? Anything at all? Rumors, things people said and then stopped saying. The name hit her the same way it had hit her 3 days ago at the diner counter, a small, cold shock that ran straight down her spine. I worked with her, Lena said slowly, for almost 2 years. She was quiet, kept to herself, kind of like me, I guess. She swallowed. She just stopped showing up one day. Darren said she quit. Nobody really asked questions because that's not really something you do around here. People come and go. Did she quit or did she disappear? I don't know, Lena admitted, and the admission felt like something breaking loose inside her. Some door she'd kept firmly shut for 2 years finally creaking open on rusted hinges. I never let myself think about it too hard. I was scared to. I thought if I asked too many questions, I'd end up like her, whatever that means. That's smart, Rhett said, and there was no judgment in it, only a kind of weary understanding. Scared people who ask questions are the ones who end up disappeared. It's the ones who stay quiet that usually survive. Problem is, staying quiet doesn't fix anything. It just keeps you alive long enough to watch it happen to somebody else. Lena sat very still on the edge of her bed, phone pressed to her ear, feeling the full weight of 2 years of buried unease finally surfacing all at once. What are you saying? She asked. You think something happened to her? Something Darren did. I think Rhett said that a man who threatens to make people disappear usually has some experience with the concept. I don't know what happened to Beth Sutter yet, but I intend to find out. Why? The question came out sharper than she meant it to, edged with something like suspicion. Because 4 years with Darren Cole had taught her that nobody did anything without wanting something in return, and she didn't yet understand what a stranger on a motorcycle could possibly want from her or from a woman he'd never met. Why do you care? You don't know either of us. You rode into town for one lunch and now you're asking about disappearances like it's your job. There was a pause on the line, and when Rhett spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more private, a register she hadn't heard from him before. Because I've spent a long time in my life not paying attention when I should have, he said. There was somebody once, a long time ago, before the vest, before any of this, who needed somebody to notice what was happening to her, and I didn't. I was too caught up in my own mess to see it until it was too late. I've carried that a long time, Lena. Longer than I care to admit. What happened to her? She's not here anymore. His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had gone very still, very careful, like a man walking around the edge of a wound that hadn't fully healed. That's all I'll say about it. But I made myself a promise after that. If I ever saw it happening again, a woman disappearing a little more, every day right in front of everybody, and nobody willing to say a word about it, I wasn't going to look away twice. Lena sat with that for a long moment, the confession settling into the quiet of her apartment like something sacred, something she hadn't expected to be handed by a man she'd known for exactly one lunch shift and one phone call. "I don't know what I want you to do," she said finally, honestly. "I don't even know what I want for myself anymore. I've been surviving so long, I forgot there was supposed to be something after surviving." "You don't have to know yet," Rhett said. "You just have to stay safe long enough to figure it out. Can you do that?" "I don't know." That's an honest answer. I'll take it. A pause and then gentler, "Lena, if things get bad, if he puts his hands on you again, if he does anything more than yell, you call me. Doesn't matter what time. I don't care if it's 3 in the morning. You call and I'll be there before you finish explaining why. You don't even know how far away you are." "Doesn't matter how far, I'll be there." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the silence between them stretched out, not uncomfortable, just full of things neither of them had the language for yet. "Get some sleep," Rhett said eventually. "Tomorrow's another shift, and you're going to need to be steady on your feet." "You say that like you know something's coming." "I've got a feeling," he said. "Men like Darren Cole, once they feel cornered, they don't calm down. They escalate. You should be ready for that." He was right, though neither of them could have known exactly how right or how soon. The next morning arrived, gray and heavy clouds pressing low over Harris Valley, and Lana walked into the diner with the strange, hollowed-out feeling of a person who has slept only in fragments, her mind circling all night around the conversation with Rhett, around the name Beth. Sutter around the word disappear that Darren had used so casually, so confidently, like a tool he'd used before and knew the shape of. Darren was already there when she arrived, standing behind the counter with a stillness that immediately put her on alert. He didn't look up when the bell above the door rang. He didn't call out his usual sharp greeting, the one designed to remind her first thing every morning exactly how replaceable she was. He just watched her walk in, eyes tracking her the entire way to the employee area, and something about that silent, patient attention frightened her more than any of his shouting ever had. "Morning," she said carefully, hanging up her jacket. "Morning." His voice was flat, controlled, too controlled. She didn't ask what was wrong. Asking questions had never once made her situation better, and she'd learned over 4 years that silence was the only currency that occasionally bought her a few hours of peace. The morning rush came and went, and Darren said little, watch much, and Lena felt the pressure of his attention building behind her spine like weather gathering before a storm. It was nearly 10:30 in the lull between breakfast and lunch when he finally spoke again, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "I made some calls this morning," he said, wiping down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. "About your biker friend." Lena's stomach tightened. "He's not my friend. I told you I don't even know him." "Funny thing," Darren continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Turns out that club he rides with the Hells Angels, they've got a reputation. Not the kind of reputation that makes a smart business owner comfortable having them poking around his town asking questions about his employees." He set down the rag, looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "You know what happens to towns, like Harris Valley, when outsiders start stirring up trouble? Businesses suffer. People get scared. And you know who they blame when a nice, quiet town suddenly isn't quiet anymore." "I haven't done anything, Darren. You brought this here." His voice, still quiet, had an edge to it now, something sharpening beneath the surface calm. "Whether you meant to or not, you brought this here. And now I've got a decision to make about whether keeping you around is worth the trouble you're causing me." The threat was clear enough, even wrapped in the language of business decisions and reputation, and Lena felt the old familiar fear rise up in her chest. The fear of losing the only income she had, the only life, however small and painful, that she'd managed to build for herself in this town. But underneath the fear, something else was moving now, something that hadn't been there 4 days ago. A voice, quiet but insistent, that sounded almost like Rhett's, asking her the same question over and over. Is surviving quietly the same as living? She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in 4 years, she let herself sit with the question instead of burying it immediately beneath the next task, the next order, the next apology. The lunch rush that day was smaller than usual. A light crowd scattered at tables, the kind of slow afternoon that should have felt like a small mercy after the tension of the morning. Instead, it felt like the quiet before something, a held breath, stretching thin across the diner floor. At exactly 1 o'clock, the bell above the door rang, and Lena looked up to see a man she didn't recognize, Walking mid-40s, clean-cut, wearing a jacket too formal for a roadside diner, carrying himself with the particular stiffness of someone accustomed to being listened to. He scanned the room briefly before his eyes settled on Darren, and something passed between the two men, a flicker of recognition that Lena caught immediately. The kind of look shared between people who already know each other and are pretending for the benefit of onlookers that they don't. Darren walked over to greet him with a warmth Lena had never once seen him extend to a customer, gripping the man's hand, gesturing him toward a booth in the back corner, away from the windows. "Table 3, get them coffee," Darren called to her voice back to its usual business register, though something underneath it felt strange, coiled. Lena approached with the coffee pot, and as she poured, she caught fragments of their conversation, low and careful, not meant for her ears, but impossible to entirely avoid. "Heard there's been some trouble," the stranger was saying. "Bikers rolling through, asking questions about an old employee." "It's handled," Darren said. "Just some outsiders trying to stir up trouble. Nothing that concerns you, Frank." Frank, Lena filed the name away, pouring coffee with hands that had gone very steady, very deliberate, the way her hands always went when her mind was working faster than her body dared to show. "It concerns me if it draws attention," Frank said, voice dropping lower still. "We can't afford attention right now, not with everything else in motion." "I said it's handled." Darren's voice had an edge to it now, a warning. "Drop it." Frank glanced up, and his eyes caught Lena's for just a moment, a cold, assessing look, the kind that made her skin crawl, before he looked back at Darren and lowered his voice further to the rest of their conversation dissolving into a murmur she could no longer parse. She walked away with the coffee pot, heart hammering, mind racing through what she just heard. Everything else in motion. What did that mean? What kind of business partnership did Darren Cole have that required careful coded conversations in the back corner of a roadside diner, conversations about attention and trouble, and things that needed to stay handled? She thought of Beth Sutter. She thought of the word disappear. And for the first time, she let herself fully consider the terrifying possibility that Darren's cruelty toward her wasn't the only secret this diner was hiding. She didn't get a chance to think much further on it, because at that exact moment, the low, familiar rumble of motorcycle engines rolled through the parking lot outside, and every head in the diner turned toward the windows. It wasn't the whole convoy this time, just 3 bikes pulling into the gravel lot with an unhurried confidence, and Lena's chest tightened with a complicated rush of emotion as she recognized Rhett dismounting the lead bike, removing his helmet, running a hand through his gray hair before walking toward the diner door. Darren saw him too. His face changed instantly, the warmth he'd shown Frank draining away, replaced by something harder, more guarded. "Get rid of him," he muttered to Lena as he passed her, heading toward the back office. "I mean it. Don't serve him. Tell him we're full." But it was too late. The bell rang and Rhett walked in, and behind him 2 other men Lena didn't recognize, both wearing the same colors, both carrying the same watchful stillness she'd noticed in Rhett on his first visit. He didn't sit down this time. He walked straight to the counter, eyes finding Lena, immediately scanning her face, her posture, the way she held her shoulders in a way that felt less like a greeting and more like a careful inventory of damage. "You all right?" he asked, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry. She stopped herself before the automatic lie could finish forming, surprised at her own hesitation. "It's been a hard morning." Something shifted in his expression, and he glanced past her toward the back office where Darren had disappeared, and toward the booth in the corner where Frank sat watching the exchange with narrowed, calculating eyes. "Who's that?" Rhett said, not really a question. "I don't know his name. Frank, I think." Darren seemed to know him. "They were talking about—" She lowered her voice further. "They were talking about trouble, about something needing to stay handled. I don't know what it means, but it scared me." Rhett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he exchanged a brief glance with the 2 men behind him, a wordless communication that seemed to settle something between them. "You said his name was Frank," Rhett said slowly. "You know if he's local?" "I've never seen him before today." Rhett nodded, filing the information away with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, and then his eyes returned to her, softer, now the assessment fading into something closer to concern. "Did Darren hurt you again since we talked?" Lena hesitated, aware of Frank's eyes still on them from across the room, aware of the thin ice she was standing on, the careful math of how much truth she could afford to give voice to in a public space where anything she said might make its way back to Darren in some twisted, dangerous form. He grabbed my wrist, she admitted, finally quiet. Yesterday when he found your note. Rhett's expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes went very still, very focused, the way still water goes right before it's disturbed. Show me. She glanced around instinctively, checking for Darren, for Frank, for anyone who might see, and then pulled back her sleeve just enough to reveal the faint purpling bruise circling her wrist, the shape of fingers still visible against her pale skin. One of the men behind Rhett made a low sound, something between disgust and anger, quickly swallowed. Rhett said nothing at all, which somehow felt louder than if he'd shouted. Cover it up, he said finally, his voice carefully even. Don't let him see you showed me. She pulled her sleeve back down, just as the back office door opened, and Darren emerged, his face arranged into a mask of professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. Help you gentlemen with something, he asked, walking toward the counter, with the deliberate stride of a man trying to project confidence he didn't fully feel. Just getting some coffee, Rhett said, his voice easy now, the sharp focus from moments before folded away somewhere Darren couldn't see. Unless there's a problem with that. No problem at all. Darren's smile was thin-strained. Lena, get these men some coffee. Actually, Rhett said, I was hoping to have a word with you first, in private. Darren's smile flickered. I'm pretty busy right now. Won't take long. There was something in the way Rhett said it, calm, unhurried, but with an undertone that left absolutely no room for refusal, that made Darren's shoulders stiffen. He glanced toward the back corner booth where Frank sat watching the entire exchange with sharp, alert eyes, and something passed between the two men, a silent calculation. Fine, Darren said finally. My office, 2 minutes. They disappeared into the back together, and Lena stood frozen at the counter, coffee pot forgotten in her hand, every nerve in her body straining to hear what might be happening behind that closed door. The two men who'd come in with Rhett took up positions near the counter, not quite guarding it, but close enough that their presence felt deliberate, a quiet wall between Lena and the rest of the diner. Frank in the back booth had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the office door, and Lena noticed his hand drift toward the inside of his jacket in a gesture that made her blood run cold, the careful, practiced movement of a man checking that something was still where he expected it to be. She didn't know what was happening behind that closed door. She wouldn't find out the full truth of it for several more days. But when Rhett emerged 4 minutes later, his face carefully blank, and Darren followed a moment after him, pale and visibly shaken, in a way she'd never once seen him, not angry, not blustering, but genuinely deeply frightened, Lena understood that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power inside Cole's diner. Rhett walked past her without stopping. Without another word, the two men falling into step behind him, and the bell above the door rang 3 times as they exited, and moments later the low rumble of engines filled the parking lot and then faded away down Route 9. Darren stood very still behind the counter, staring at nothing, his hands trembling faintly against the counter's edge. Darren, Lena asked carefully, is everything? Get back to work, he said, and his voice for the first time in 4 years had lost its edge entirely. It sounded small. It sounded scared. He disappeared into the back office again and didn't emerge for the rest of the afternoon. Frank left shortly after, without finishing his coffee, sliding out of the booth with a controlled urgency that suggested whatever had just happened had rattled him as much as it had rattled Darren. He didn't look at Lena on his way out. He didn't need to. His face told her everything. The tight jaw, the quick, nervous glance toward the parking lot, the way his hand stayed close to his jacket. The entire walk to his car. Whatever Rhett had said in that office, it had cracked something open, and Lena spent the rest of her shift in a state of suspended tension, waiting for the walls to come down, waiting for Darren's fear to curdle back into anger the way it always eventually did. It didn't happen that day. Darren stayed in his office until closing, and when Lena finally left for the night, gravel crunching under her tired feet as she walked toward her car, she found her phone buzzing in her pocket, a text from an unknown number that she somehow knew without even opening it would be from Rhett. He won't touch you again. Not for a while anyway. Told him some things he needed to hear. She stared at the message for a long moment before typing back with shaking fingers. What did you tell him? The response came quickly. That I know about Beth. That I know he's not as careful as he thinks he is. That if anything happens to you, there won't be a place in this country far enough for him to hide. Told him I've got people watching now. That part's true. Lena sat in her car in the empty parking lot, engine not yet started, reading the message over 3 times. "Why are you doing this?" she finally typed. "You don't owe me anything." The reply took longer this time, long enough that she wondered if he was choosing his words as carefully with his thumbs as he did with his voice. Because somebody should have done this for Beth. Because somebody should have done it a long time before now for you. I can't undo 4 years, Lena. But I can make sure the next 4 don't look like the last 4. That's all this is. She read the words until they blurred slightly, her eyes stinging with an emotion she didn't fully have a name for: gratitude tangled up with disbelief, tangled up with a grief she hadn't let herself feel yet. Grief for 4 wasted years, grief for a version of herself that might have existed if someone had intervened sooner. "Thank you," she typed finally, because it was the only thing that felt true enough to send. "Don't thank me yet," came the reply. "We're not done." Darren's scared now, and scared men do one of 2 things. They fold or they get desperate. "I need you to be careful the next few days. Real careful." "What do you mean desperate?" Means if he's involved in whatever happened to Beth and he thinks the walls are closing in, he might do something reckless to protect himself. "I don't want you anywhere near him if that happens. You understand?" Lena's hands tightened around the phone, a new kind of fear settling into her chest. Not the old familiar fear of Darren's temper, but something sharper, something that suggested the stakes of this situation had just grown far larger than a single cruel boss and a frightened waitress. "What did he say when you mentioned it, Beth?" In the office, there was a long pause before the reply came through. "He didn't say anything. That's what worried me most. Man gets accused of something he didn't do, he argues, denies it, gets angry. Darren just went white and stopped talking entirely. That's not the reaction of an innocent man, Lena. That's the reaction of a man calculating how much trouble he's actually in." She sat with that in the darkening parking lot for a long time after the message stopped, the weight of it settling over her like a physical thing heavier than any bruise Darren had ever left on her skin. 2 years she'd told herself not to think too hard about Beth Sutter. 2 years of convincing herself that ignorance was safety, that some doors were better left unopened. And now here she was sitting in her car in the dark, staring down the possibility that behind one of those unopened doors was something far worse than she'd ever let herself imagine, and that she might be the only person left standing close enough to the truth to finally drag it into the light. She drove home slower than usual that night, checking her mirrors more than she needed to, jumping at shadows that weren't there, the fear that had always lived quietly in the back of her mind, now sitting fully awake, fully alert, refusing to be ignored. When she finally pulled into her apartment complex and killed the engine, she sat in the darkness for a long moment before finally allowing herself to cry. Not the careful, contained tears she sometimes allowed herself after a particularly bad shift, but something larger, something that had been building for 4 years and had finally found a crack wide enough to escape through. She cried for herself, for the woman she'd been before Darren Cole had worn her down into something smaller. She cried for Beth Sutter wherever she was, whatever had happened to her. And underneath the tears, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that wasn't quite hope, not yet, but was at least its distant cousin. The possibility of an ending. The possibility, however faint, however far away, that this story didn't have to end the way it had always seemed destined to end. Her phone buzzed one more time before she went inside. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start figuring out what actually happened to Beth Sutter. I've got a feeling the answer's closer than either of us realized." Lena wiped her eyes, took a long, steadying breath, and typed back a single word before finally climbing out of her car and walking toward her front door, toward a night of sleep that would come easier than it had in years, despite everything, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. Okay. Behind her in the quiet dark of the parking lot, she didn't notice the car idling 2 rows back. Engine off, headlights dark. A figure sitting motionless behind the wheel, watching her front door long after she disappeared inside. Frank had followed her home. Lena didn't know she was being watched. She slept that night for the first time in weeks without waking every hour to check the lock on her door, the exhaustion of the day finally pulling her under into something deep and dreamless, and when her alarm went off the next morning, she felt briefly almost normal. A fragile, unfamiliar lightness in her chest that lasted exactly as long as it took her to walk out to her car and notice the flat tire. Not just flat, slashed, a clean, deliberate cut along the sidewall, the kind of damage that didn't happen by accident, didn't happen from a nail in the road or bad luck on gravel. She stood there in the gray morning light, staring at the ruined tire, feeling the fragile lightness of the night before curdle instantly into something cold and familiar. Fear, not the old fear, the diner fear, the fear of Darren's raised voice and heavy hand. Something new, something that had teeth she hadn't felt before. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. "Someone slashed my tire," she typed to Rhett, fingers fumbling over the letters. "Last night, in my own parking lot." The reply came almost instantly, faster than she expected, as though he'd been awake and waiting. "Don't touch anything else on the car. Don't drive it. I'm sending someone to look at it in the next 10 minutes. Stay inside until they get there. I have a shift, Rhett. I can't just call in sick. Today only. I mean it, Lena. Somebody wants you scared and stuck. Don't hand them the second part for free." She stood in her doorway another moment, phone clutched tight, looking out at the slashed tire glinting faintly in the early light, and something in her chest tightened at the thought of calling Darren, of hearing his voice ask why, of navigating another lie stacked on top of the exhaustion already sitting heavy behind her eyes. But she called in sick anyway. It was, she realized, as she hung up, the first time in 4 years she'd ever done it. Darren's voice on the phone had been clipped, suspicious, laced with something that might have been anger, if it hadn't been buried under a layer of fear that hadn't fully thawed since Rhett's visit to his office the day before. "You better actually be sick," he'd said before hanging up without waiting for her answer. 15 minutes later, a man that she didn't recognize pulled into her apartment lot on a motorcycle, dismounted and crouched beside her car without a word of introduction, running his fingers along the slashed rubber with the careful attention of someone who'd seen this kind of damage before and knew exactly what it meant. "Clean cut," he said, finally straightening up. "Box cutter or a hunting knife, not random. Somebody wanted you to know they'd been here." "Who are you?" "Name's Cutter. Ride with Rex." He said it like that explained everything, and in a strange way, it did. The same watchful stillness Lena had noticed in Rhett, the same unhurried competence. "He's on his way. Wanted eyes on you till he got here." "You don't have to do that. I'm fine, I just—" "Ma'am." Cutter's voice was gentle but firm, cutting through her automatic deflection the way Rhett's had cut through it days before. "Somebody slashed your tire in the middle of the night while you were sleeping 50 feet away. That's not a fine situation. That's somebody sending a message, and messages like that, they usually mean something bigger's coming." Lena wrapped her arms around herself, the morning air suddenly feeling colder than it had a few minutes before. "You think it was Darren? Maybe. Maybe somebody working for him." Cutter's eyes scanned the parking lot, the surrounding buildings, with the careful, professional sweep of a man doing threat assessment without making a show of it. "Rex mentioned a fella named Frank. You said he was talking business with your boss yesterday? That name mean anything else to you?" "No, I'd never seen him before." "We're working on that." Cutter's phone buzzed and he glanced at it briefly before looking back up at her. "Rex is 5 minutes out. Why don't you go on back inside, lock the door, we'll handle the car." She went back inside, though. Handle the car turned out to mean something far more thorough than she expected. By the time Red arrived, 2 more men had joined Cutter in the parking lot, one photographing the tire from multiple angles, another walking a slow perimeter of the building, checking for anything else out of place. Rhett found her in her small kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't actually managed to drink, and the look on his face when he saw her, some careful blend of relief and barely restrained anger, told her everything about how seriously he was taking this. "You didn't see or hear anything last night?" he asked, sitting across from her at the small table. "Nothing. I slept through the whole thing, better than I have in weeks, actually." The irony of it made her laugh short and humorless. "Somebody was probably standing right outside my window while I finally got a decent night's sleep. That's not something to feel bad about." His voice was quiet but firm. "You needed the rest. This isn't your fault." "Isn't it, though?" The words came out sharper than she intended, 4 years of buried resentment finding an unexpected outlet. "I called you. I let myself hope things could be different. And now somebody's slashing my tires in the middle of the night. Maybe I should have just kept my head down. Maybe this is what happens when—" "Stop." Rhett's voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to cut her off mid-sentence. "Don't you dare do that. Don't you dare take responsibility for somebody else's cruelty. You didn't slash your own tire, Lena. Somebody else did that because They're scared of what you might know or what you might say or what might happen if the people around you actually start caring what happens to you. That fear is theirs, not yours. Lena stared down at her coffee, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of his words settling somewhere deep in her chest, somewhere that hadn't been touched by kindness in longer than she could measure. I don't know how to do this, she admitted quietly. I don't know how to be someone who fights back. I've spent 4 years learning exactly the opposite. Nobody's asking you to fight anybody, Rhett said. That's not your job. Your job is just to stay safe and to tell me the truth when I ask you something. I'll handle the rest. That's a lot to ask of someone you barely know. Maybe. His pale eyes held hers steadily. But I meant what I said on the phone. I've got a debt to pay from a long time ago to somebody who needed exactly this and didn't get it. I'm not walking away from paying it now. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet stretching between them, comfortable in a way that surprised her, and then Rhett's phone buzzed sharply against the table, and his expression shifted the moment he read the screen. What is it? Lena asked, alarm creeping into her voice. Cutter found something. He was already standing, moving toward the door. Come on, you need to see this. Outside, Cutter stood near the back corner of the building, holding up a small object between two gloved fingers, a tiny black device, no bigger than a coin with a faint blinking light along one horn edge. GPS tracker, Cutter said grimly. Found it stuck under the wheel well. Somebody's been keeping tabs on where you drive Miss Harper. For how long, there's no way to know for sure. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. Someone's been tracking me, she said slowly, the words feeling foreign and terrifying in her own mouth. This whole time, following where I go. That combined with the tire, Rhett said, his voice going harder, flatter, tells me this isn't just Darren losing his temper. This is somebody organized, somebody thinking ahead. Frank, Lena whispered. Maybe. Rhett took the tracker from Cutter, turning it over in his fingers, studying it with narrowed eyes. This kind of hardware isn't cheap, and it isn't the kind of thing your average diner owner has lying around. This is somebody with resources. Somebody used to covering their tracks. The implication hung heavy in the morning air, and Lena felt her carefully rebuilt sense of hope from the night before crumbling under the weight of a fear that had suddenly grown much larger than one cruel man behind a diner counter. What do I do? She asked, and her voice cracked slightly on the question, the composure she'd been trying to maintain finally beginning to fray. You come with us for now, Rhett said, and it wasn't a suggestion, though. His tone remained careful, gentle, giving her room to object if she needed to. Just for today, until we figure out exactly what we're dealing with. I've got a place a few miles out, safe, quiet. Nobody's going to find you there while we sort this out. I can't just disappear, Rhett. I have a job I have. You have a life that's been shrinking for 4 years. Rhett said quietly, into smaller and smaller spaces until the only thing left in it is surviving one shift at a time. I'm not asking you to disappear forever. I'm asking you to be safe for one day while grown men figure out how deep this actually goes. Lena looked at the tracker in his hand, at the slashed tire still sitting on her car, at the careful, watchful faces of the men standing guard around her small apartment, and she felt something shift inside her. Not surrender, not exactly, but a recognition that the ground beneath her feet had changed shape overnight and that pretending otherwise would only get her hurt. Okay, she said finally. One day. It took her only a few minutes to gather what she needed. Hands still trembling slightly as she packed a small bag, Rhett waiting patiently by the door. His presence somehow both intimidating and in a way she didn't fully understand yet deeply reassuring. The ride out to his place happened in Cutter's truck, Lena in the passenger seat, Rhett following behind on his motorcycle, and she spent the 20 minutes watching Harris Valley slide past the window, the diner, the gas station, the church, the feed store, the entire small world she'd built her life around for 4 years, suddenly looking impossibly fragile from this new distance. The property Rhett brought her to sat at the end of a long gravel drive, tucked back against a tree line, a modest ranch house that looked from the outside entirely unremarkable, exactly the kind of place nobody would think to look for a frightened waitress in, hiding from whatever storm was building around her. Inside, though, Lena quickly realized it was more fortress than farmhouse. Cameras mounted discreetly near the entrances, a gun safe visible through a half-open closet door. The quiet, careful organization of men who had learned through hard experience exactly how to protect the people and things that mattered to them. "You'll be safe here," Rhett said, showing her to a small guest room. "Cutter or one of the others will be around all day. Nobody gets near this place without us knowing about it first." "How do you know that?" Lena asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the morning. "How do you know Darren or Frank or whoever's behind this? How do you know they won't find me here?" "Because this isn't the first time I've had to keep somebody safe," Rhett said, and something in his voice told her not to ask for further explanation, not yet. "Get some rest. I've got calls to make." He left her alone and Lena lay back against the unfamiliar pillow, staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling. And despite everything, despite the fear of the tracker, the slashed tire, the growing certainty that she'd stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined, she found herself drifting into a heavy, exhausted sleep within minutes. She woke to raised voices. Not shouting exactly, but the low, urgent murmur of men speaking, quickly, tension threading through every word even at a distance, and Lena sat up in the unfamiliar bed with her heart already hammering, disoriented for a moment before the events of the morning came rushing back. She crept to the door, opened it carefully, and found Rhett standing in the small living room with two other men, a laptop open on the table between them, all three faces set in grim, focused lines. "Confirmed it's the same guy," one of the men was saying. "Frank Delgado, runs an operation out of 3 counties over. Human trafficking, mostly runaway girls and undocumented workers. Uses small businesses as fronts, restaurants, diners, motels, places where a missing worker doesn't raise questions because the turnover's already high and nobody expects loyalty." Lena's blood went cold in the doorway, the word trafficking landing in her chest like a physical blow. "Darren's Diner," she said, and all 3 men turned toward her at once, surprise flickering across their faces at her sudden appearance. "That's what this is. That's what happened to Beth." Rhett's expression softened slightly, though the grimness underneath it didn't fade. "Come sit down, Lena. You need to hear this." She crossed the room on unsteady legs and sat, and Rhett continued, his voice careful, measured, clearly trying to deliver the information without overwhelming her further than the morning already had. "We pulled everything we could on Frank Delgado in the last few hours. He's been operating in this region for at least 6 years, using local businesses as recruitment points. Vulnerable employees, women with no family close by, no support system, people who wouldn't be reported missing quickly or thoroughly. He pays off the business owners to look the other way sometimes, to actively help identify targets. And Darren," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper, "he's one of the business owners." "We think so. We don't have proof yet, not the kind that would hold up anywhere official. But the pattern fits. Beth Sutter disappearing without a trace, no forwarding address, no family asking questions. Darren's fear when I mentioned her name. Frank showing up the very next day for what looked like a business meeting." Rhett's jaw tightened. "It fits together in a way I don't like." "Am I—" Lena's voice cracked and she had to stop, swallow, force herself to finish the question. "Am I a target? Is that what the tracker was for?" The silence that followed her question was answer enough, but Rhett gave her the words anyway because she deserved the truth even when the truth was terrifying. "We think Darren may have flagged you to Frank as someone who might become a problem," he said carefully. "Someone who was starting to ask questions, starting to pull away from the control he had had over you for 4 years. In their world, that makes you a liability. And people who see liabilities as things to eliminate rather than people to protect, that's exactly the kind of operation we're dealing with here." Lena sat with that for a long moment, the full weight of it pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. 4 years of quiet endurance suddenly reframed in the harshest possible light. Not just an abusive workplace, but a potential pipeline into something unspeakable. Something that had already swallowed one young woman without a trace and had marked her, Lena, as the next possible name on a list nobody outside this room even knew existed. "I need to sit with him," she said, finally standing on legs that felt unsteady beneath her. "I need a minute." "Take whatever time you need," Rhett said gently. "Nobody's rushing you." She walked to the small back porch of the house, gravel crunching under her feet, the afternoon air cool against her flushed face, and she stood there for a long time, arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the tree line without really seeing it, her mind replaying 4 years of small cruelties, now recontextualized as something far darker than she'd ever allowed herself to imagine. Rhett found her there 20 minutes later, standing quietly a respectful distance away, until she acknowledged him. "You don't have to talk," he said. "I just didn't want you out here alone." "How do you know all this?" Lena said, not turning to look at him. "The trafficking, the patterns, all of it. That's not the kind of thing regular people just happen to know." Rhett was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before, something old and unhealed underneath the careful control. "The woman I told you about," he said. "The one I didn't protect. Her name was Carol. She worked at a gas station outside Reno back when I was younger, angrier, spending more time drinking than thinking. I saw the bruises. I saw the way she flinched around her manager. I told myself it wasn't my business." His voice roughened slightly. 3 months later, she was gone, just like your friend Beth. No trace, no explanation. Nothing but an empty apartment and a manager who suddenly seemed a lot more nervous than he used to be. What happened to her? We found out 2 years later. Same operation, different names, different faces, but the same pattern all the way through. By the time we pieced it together, it was too late to save her. But it wasn't too late to shut down the men responsible. His eyes, when he finally looked at Lena, held a depth of grief that made her chest ache. "That's when I started paying closer attention. That's when I made the promise I told you about. I've helped stop 3 operations like this since then. Found 2 women in time. Was too late for one other besides Carol." "I'm sorry," Lena whispered. "Don't be sorry for me. Just let me help you so I don't have to add your name to that second list." His voice was steady again, the vulnerability folded carefully back beneath his usual composure. "We're going to figure this out, Lena. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to be careful, and I need you to understand that whatever happens next, you're not walking through it alone anymore." She turned to face him fully. Then the afternoon light catching the silver in his beard, the deep lines of a life that had clearly held far more loss than she'd initially imagined, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 4 years finally cautiously began to loosen. "Okay," she said, "I trust you." The rest of the afternoon passed in careful planning, Red and his men working through what little evidence they had, mapping out a strategy that Lena only partially understood, but recognized as methodical. Careful, the work of people who had done this before and knew exactly how dangerous a mistake could be. Around 6 o'clock, Cutter's phone buzzed with an update that changed the entire shape of the afternoon. "Darren just left his diner early," he reported, reading from his screen. "Our guy watching the place says he looked spooked, practically ran to his car." "Where'd he go?" Red asked immediately. "Tracking his car now. Looks like he's headed toward the edge of town. Old warehouse district near the rail yard." Red's expression sharpened into something focused and dangerous. "That's not a place a diner owner has any business being." "You think he's meeting Frank?" Lena asked, her pulse quickening. "I think," Rhett said slowly, "that a scared man who's just realized the walls are closing in sometimes does something desperate to try and make the problem disappear before it gets any bigger." He looked at Cutter. "Get eyes on that warehouse. Quietly. I don't want anybody spooked before we know what we're looking at." "On it." The next hour stretched out in an agony of waiting, Lena pacing the small living room while Rhett and his men worked their phones and laptops with quiet, controlled urgency, piecing together fragments of information as they came in. She thought of Darren's face that morning, pale and shaken after his conversation with Rhett, and she wondered with a fresh chill whether fear had pushed him toward confession or toward something far more dangerous. At 7:15, Cutter's phone rang, and the tension in the room spiked instantly as he answered, listening for a winning moment before his face went hard. "They've got 2 vehicles at the warehouse," he reported. "Darren's car and another one we don't recognize. Our guy says he can hear raised voices from outside. Sounds like an argument." "Can he get close enough to hear what they're saying?" Red asked. "He's trying now." Lena sat frozen on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tight in her lap, watching Rhett's face for any sign of what might be unfolding miles away in a warehouse she'd never seen, involving a confrontation she'd inadvertently set into motion the moment she decided to keep a folded note instead of throwing it away. 5 more minutes passed in tense silence before Cutter's phone buzzed again, and this time when he read the message, his face went pale in a way that made Lena's stomach drop straight through the floor. "What?" she said. "What is it?" Cutter looked up at Rhett, then at Lena, his expression grim. "Our guy says Frank just threatened Darren. Told him if he can't keep his diner quiet, keep his employees under control, then Frank's people will need to handle the loose ends themselves." Cutter's jaw tightened. He used your name, Lena, specifically. The room seemed to tilt slightly around her, the words landing like a physical blow, and she felt Rhett's hand come to rest gently on her shoulder, steadying her, grounding her against the sudden wave of terror threatening to pull her under. What did he say? She managed. Exactly. Cutter hesitated, glancing at Rhett as if seeking permission, and when Rhett gave a small nod, he continued, his voice careful. He said, and I'm reading this exactly as it was relayed to me, that waitress of yours is a liability now. Bikers sniffing around asking about Beth. You either fix your problem or I fix it for you, and you won't like how I do things. Lena's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, the full, terrible reality of the threat settling over her like a physical weight. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't a slashed tire or a tracking device hidden beneath a wheel well. This was a man, a stranger she'd exchanged perhaps 30 seconds of eye contact with, discussing her elimination in a warehouse across town as casually as he might discuss a supply order. What did Darren say back? She whispered. Cutter checked his phone, again scrolling. Says Darren tried to argue, said you weren't a real problem, said he had it handled. Frank didn't seem convinced. Told him he's got 48 hours to prove it, or Frank sends his own people to Harris Valley to, quote, handle things properly. 48 hours. The number hung in the room like a countdown clock, suddenly made visible, and Lena felt the full architecture of her careful, exhausted survival collapsing, entirely replaced by something far more urgent, far more terrifying than anything 4 years with Darren Cole had ever prepared her for. I need to go to the police, she said, standing abruptly, her voice rising with panic she could no longer contain. This is real. This is trafficking. This is threats against my life. Someone has to. Lena, Rhett's voice cut through her rising panic, calm but firm, and he stood to face her directly, his hands coming to rest lightly on her shoulders. Listen to me. Local police in a town this size, we don't know how deep Frank's reach goes. Darren mentioned people, connections. If even one officer on that force is compromised, going to them now could get you killed faster than staying quiet. Then what do? I can't just sit here waiting for 48 hours to run out. You're not going to sit here, Rhett said. We're going to use those 48 hours to build something airtight. Evidence that goes over the local police's heads straight to state or federal authorities who aren't compromised. Evidence that puts Frank Delgado away for good and Darren Cole along with him, and gets justice for Beth Sutter in the process. In 48 hours, that's insane. That's not enough time to... It's exactly enough time. Rhett said, his voice steady, certain, if we move fast and if you help us. Lena stared at him, chest heaving, the fear still coursing hot through her veins, and something in his unwavering calm, his absolute certainty, began to slow the frantic spiral of her thoughts. What do you need from me? Everything you remember, Rhett said. Every conversation with Darren that felt strange. Every detail about Beth's disappearance, no matter how small. Every name you've heard, every place you've seen, mentioned, every piece of the puzzle you've been carrying around without realizing it mattered. Lena took a long, shaking breath, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt something click into place. And so in her fear, though, the fear remained coiled tight beneath her ribs, but purpose sharp and clear, cutting through the fog of exhaustion and survival that had defined her existence for so long. Okay, she said, let's start. They worked late into the night, Lena recounting every detail she could remember: the day Beth had stopped showing up, the strange phone calls Darren used to take in his office with the door locked, a delivery truck that came at odd hours from a company whose name she'd never quite caught, cash transactions that never seemed to match the diner's modest daily traffic. Each piece on its own felt small, insignificant. The kind of detail she'd trained herself to ignore because noticing meant understanding, and understanding meant danger. But laid out together, mapped across a whiteboard Rhett's men had set up in the living room, the pieces began slowly and terribly to form a shape. This delivery truck, one of Rhett's men said, tapping the whiteboard where Lena's description had been written down. You said it came at odd hours. You remember any markings on it? Company name, anything? There was a logo, Lena said slowly, closing her eyes, forcing herself back into memories she'd deliberately blurred over the years. Blue and white, something with a bird, I think. An eagle, maybe? I only saw it a few times, always real early before the diner opened. Blue and white eagle logo. The man typed quickly into his laptop. That's something. Could take a few hours to run down, but it's something. By midnight, exhaustion had caught up with all of them, Lena's eyes burning with fatigue, her voice hoarse from hours of talking through memories she'd spent years trying not to examine too closely. Rhett finally called a halt to the work, insisting she get some real sleep before continuing in the morning. "We've got a good start," he said, walking her back toward the guest room. "You did good tonight, Lena. Real good." "It doesn't feel like enough," she admitted, pausing at the doorway. 48 hours and all we've got is some memories and a delivery truck with a bird on it." "It's more than we had this morning," Rhett said, "and we've still got tomorrow to work with. Try to sleep. You're safe here tonight." She nodded, though sleep felt like an impossible request given everything churning through her mind, and as she turned to enter the room, a question she'd been holding back all evening finally slipped free. "Rhett, if Darren doesn't fix his problem in 48 hours, if he can't prove I'm not a threat, what happens to him?" Rhett's expression darkened slightly, something grim and unreadable passing behind his pale eyes. "Men like Frank don't tend to leave loose ends of any kind," he said quietly. "Darren might find out the hard way that being the one giving the orders doesn't protect you from the people you were taking orders from." The implications settled over Lena with unexpected weight. The possibility that Darren, her tormentor, for 4 years the man who had bruised her jaw and crushed her spirit and threatened her very life, might himself become a casualty of the same machine he'd been feeding. She didn't know what to feel about that. Some small, wounded part of her wanted to feel nothing at all, wanted the indifference of justice finally being served on someone who deserved every consequence coming to him. But another part of her, a part shaped by 4 years of proximity to his fear and his cruelty in equal measure, felt something uncomfortably close to pity for a man who had built his own trap and was now perhaps about to fall into it. "Get some sleep," Rhett said again, gently, seeming to read some of this conflict on her face. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She lay awake for a long time after he left, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling, replaying the day's revelations over and over, the tracker making tire Frank's threat, the 48-hour countdown now ticking steadily towards some unknown reckoning. Somewhere across town in a house she'd never seen, Darren Cole was likely lying awake too, staring at his own ceiling, weighing his own impossible choices, caught between a criminal organization that saw him as expendable and a moral reckoning he'd spent years successfully avoiding. She didn't know which of them was more frightened that night. She didn't know, lying there in the dark, exhausted and terrified, and strangely, impossibly hopeful all at once, that the next 48 hours would reshape not just her own life, but the entire fragile architecture of Harris Valley itself, exposing secrets that had been buried for years, forcing a reckoning that the whole town, whether it wanted to or not, was about to be forced to witness. Her phone buzzed one final time before she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. "One more thing," Rhett had written. "The delivery truck. Eagle logo, blue and white. My guy found a match. Company's called Talon Freight. Registered out of state, 3 different addresses on file, none of them real. That's not a shipping company, Lena. That's a shell." She read the message twice, her exhausted mind struggling to fully grasp its implications, and typed back the only question that mattered. "What does that mean for tomorrow?" The reply came a moment later, and it was the last thing she read before sleep finally mercifully pulled her under. "Means we just found the thread that unravels the whole thing. Get some rest. Tomorrow we pull it." Morning came fast, faster than Lena felt ready for, and she woke to the sound of low voices already moving through the house, urgent and focused, the particular energy of people who hadn't slept much but had used the hours anyway. She found Rhett in the living room, the whiteboard from the night before now, covered in additional notes, red markers circling a name she didn't recognize, lines connecting it to Talon Freight, to Frank Delgado, to a string of addresses across 3 counties. "Talon Freight's not just moving through Darren's diner," Rhett said without preamble, sensing her presence before she'd even spoken. "My guy pulled records overnight. Same shell companies tied to 2 other businesses in neighboring counties. A motel outside Bakerstown, a trucking depot near the state line." "That's the pattern you talked about," Lena said, sitting down heavily still, fighting off the fog of interrupted sleep. "Small businesses, fronts. Exactly the pattern." Rhett tapped the board. "Which means this isn't just about you or about Beth. This is a network. Frank Delgado isn't some local thug throwing his weight around a diner in Harris Valley. He's a piece of something much bigger." The weight of that landed heavy in Lena's chest, the scope of what she'd stumbled into, expanding again, the way it kept expanding every time she thought she'd finally reached the bottom of it. "So what do we do with that?" she asked. "We can't exactly walk into a state police office and hand them a whiteboard full of theories." "No," Red agreed, "but we can hand them something better." He nodded to Cutter, who turned his laptop around to face her, and on the screen was a grainy but legible photograph. A delivery truck, blue and white Eagle logo clearly visible on the side panel, parked in a lot Lena didn't recognize. "Where did you get this?" "Static camera near the state line, public traffic footage, easier to access than you'd think if you know where to look." Cutter clicked through a few more images. "This truck's made the same run 4 times this month. Bakerstown Motel, your diner, then back out toward a warehouse near the rail yard. Same route, almost the exact same time each trip." "The warehouse where Darren met Frank," Lena said slowly. "Same one." Rhett leaned forward, his expression sharpening into something focused and dangerous. "If we can get eyes inside that warehouse, get evidence of what's actually happening there, we're not handing state police theories anymore. We're handing them a case." "How do you get eyes inside a place like that without getting caught?" Lena asked, dread already coiling in her stomach at the direction this conversation seemed to be heading. Rhett and Cutter exchanged a look, and something in that silent exchange told Lena the answer before either of them spoke it aloud. "We don't send you in, Rhett said quickly, catching the alarm rising in her face. "That's not what I'm thinking, and don't let your mind go there. But we do need someone who knows Darren's schedule, his habits, someone who can tell us exactly when that warehouse is likely to be active versus empty." "I can do that," Lena said, relief loosening the tight coil in her chest slightly. "I know his patterns better than anyone. 4 years of watching him like my life depended on it, because it usually did." "That's exactly the kind of knowledge we need," Rhett said. "You're not walking into danger, Lena. You're helping us walk around it." They spent the next hour mapping out everything Lena knew about Darren's routine the mornings he opened late. Because he'd been out somewhere the night before, the Tuesday and Friday evenings, he consistently disappeared for 2 or 3 hours without explanation. The way his phone would buzz at exact predictable intervals on certain days, always answered in the privacy of his locked office. "Tuesdays and Fridays," Rhett said, studying the pattern Lena had laid out. "That lines up with the truck's route. Cutter, get eyes on that warehouse tonight. Quiet surveillance, only nobody gets close enough to be seen." "On it." The day stretched on in a strange, suspended tension, Lena moving between moments of frantic productivity, recounting details, reviewing photographs, helping piece together a timeline that grew more damning with every hour, and long stretches of raw, exhausting fear, the 48-hour countdown ticking steadily downward in the back of her mind, no matter how hard she tried to focus on anything else. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number, and her heart nearly stopped before she recognized the area code as belonging to the diner's landline. "This is Marta. You okay? Darren's been asking where you are. Told him you were sick, but he don't believe me. Something's wrong with him today. Never seen him this jumpy." Lena's fingers hovered over the screen for a long moment before she typed back, careful, measured. "I'm okay. Taking a couple days. Is he doing anything unusual?" The reply took several minutes, long enough that Lena's anxiety climbed steadily higher with every passing second. "He had 2 men come by this morning before opening. Not customers. They talked in his office a long time. He looked scared after. Been snapping at everybody all day." "Lena, something's happening here, and I don't like it." Lena showed the messages to Rhett, who read them with a deepening frown. 2 men before opening hours," he said. "Not Frank himself, then. Could be enforcers sent to check on Darren's progress." "Progress on getting rid of me," Lena said quietly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth even as she said them. "We're not going to let that happen." Rhett's voice held an absolute certainty that I steadied something trembling in her chest. "But this tells me the clock's moving faster than we thought. We might not have the full 48 hours. Marta texted again 20 minutes later, and this time the message made Lena's blood run cold. "Darren just left again. Real hurry, didn't say where. Left the register unlocked, which he never does. Something's really wrong, Lena. I'm scared." "He's unraveling," Rhett said, reading over Lena's shoulder. "Scared men make mistakes. This could be good for us, or it could mean he's about to do something reckless." "Or both," Lena said grimly. Cutter's phone rang at that exact moment, and the room went still as he answered. listening intently before his expression shifted into something urgent. Darren's car just pulled up to the warehouse, he reported. Alone this time? No sign of Frank or the truck yet. Get our guy closer, Rhett said immediately, carefully. I want to know exactly what he's doing there. The wait that followed felt endless. Lena pacing the small living room while Rhett and Cutter monitored updates coming in fragments, each one adding another piece to a picture that was rapidly becoming clearer and more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. He's pacing, Cutter reported after several minutes. Alone inside. Our guy could see him through a side window talking on the phone, looks agitated. Can he hear anything? Trying to get closer without being seen. Another few minutes passed in tense silence, and then Cutter's phone buzzed again. And this time when he read the message, his face went carefully blank in a way that Lena had learned over the past day meant something significant had just happened. What? She said immediately. Tell me. Cutter looked up at Rhett first, a silent question passing between them, and Rhett gave a small nod. Our guy caught part of the call, Cutter said slowly. Darren was talking to someone, sounded desperate, said, and I'm reading exactly what was relayed. I can fix this myself. I don't need Frank's people involved. Give me until tonight. Fix what himself? Lena asked, though some cold, sinking certainty in her chest already suspected the answer. Cutter's eyes met hers, grave and steady. We think he's talking about you, Lena. We think Darren's decided to try and handle the problem before Frank's people show up and do it for him in whatever way Frank's people tend to do things. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the words landing with the force of a physical blow, and Lena felt her legs go weak beneath her, felt Rhett's hand catch her elbow before she could fully register that she'd swayed. He's coming for me, she whispered. He doesn't know where you are, Rhett said firmly, guiding her to sit down. This location is secure. Nobody outside this room knows you're here. You are safe, Lena. Do you understand me? You are safe right now in this moment. But tonight we're going to be ready for whatever he tries. Rhett crouched in front of her, his pale eyes holding hers with an intensity that cut through the rising panic clawing at her chest. This actually helps us in a strange way. A desperate man makes desperate moves, and desperate moves leave evidence. If Darren tries something tonight, we'll be there to catch him doing it. That sounds like a plan that puts me in danger. It's a plan that puts a trap in danger, Rhett corrected gently. Not you. You're not leaving this house tonight. But your phone, your car, the places he thinks you might be, those are bait, and bait doesn't feel pain when the trap closes. Lena took a long, shaking breath, trying to steady herself against the fear still coursing hot through her veins. What do you need me to do? For now, nothing but stay here and stay calm, Rhett said. Let us handle the rest. The afternoon crawled forward with agonizing slowness, every hour bringing fresh updates from Cutter's surveillance. Darren returning briefly to the diner, snapping at Marta hard enough that she nearly quit on the spot, then disappearing again around 4 o'clock this time toward his own house on the outskirts of town. He's building up to something, Rhett said, studying the timeline they'd assembled. This isn't a man with a plan. This is a man panicking his way toward one. By early evening, the tension in the small ranch house had grown thick enough to taste every member of Rhett's crew moving with the quiet, focused intensity of people preparing for something they knew was coming, but couldn't yet name precisely. At 7:30, Cutter's phone rang, and this time the moment he answered, his entire posture changed, straightening with an urgency that made Lena's stomach drop. He's moving, Cutter said, phone still pressed to his ear, listening. Darren just left his house, driving fast, heading toward town. A pause longer this time, his face tightening. He's headed toward Lena's apartment complex. He doesn't know I'm not there, Lena said, though the statement came out more like a question, some fragile hope that this could still be simple, could still be contained. He's about to find that out, Rhett said grimly, which means he'll either give up or he'll get more desperate trying to figure out where you actually are. They waited the minutes, stretching out with unbearable tension until Cutter's phone buzzed with an update that made his jaw tighten visibly. He's at her apartment, banging on the door. Our guy says he looks, Cutter paused, reading the message again before continuing. Says he looks unhinged, shouting her name. Neighbors are starting to look out their windows. Is he armed? Red asked sharply. Checking now. The wait for that answer felt like the longest 30 seconds of Lena's life, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. And when Cutter's phone finally buzzed again, his expression darkened further. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Our guy can see a handgun tucked in his waistband. He's not trying to hide it well." The room went very still, the weight of that information settling over everyone present, and Lena felt the fragile composure she'd been holding on to all day finally begin to crack. "He's going to hurt someone," she whispered. "If he doesn't find me, he's going to hurt someone else looking for me." "That's not going to happen." Rhett was already moving, grabbing his jacket, his voice hardening into something that brooked no argument. "Cutter, call it in. Anonymous tip, armed man, disturbing the peace, matching Darren's description and vehicle. Let the local police handle the immediate situation while we handle everything else." "You said we couldn't trust the local police," Lena said, panic rising in her voice. "We can't trust them with the trafficking case," Rhett corrected, already halfway to the door. "But a man waving a gun around outside an apartment complex scaring the neighbors, that's not something even a compromised department can afford to ignore in a town this small. Too many witnesses, too public." He was gone within minutes, Cutter close behind him, and Lena sat alone in the ranch house living room, with the third man whose name she still didn't know, both of them listening to the tense clipped updates coming through on speakerphone as the situation outside her apartment unfolded in real time. "Police just arrived," came Cutter's voice through the phone, tight with focus. "Darren's arguing with them, denying the gun. They're searching him now." A long, agonizing pause. "Found it," Cutter continued. "They're cuffing him. Illegal concealed weapon disturbing the peace. Not the charges we need, but it's something. Gets him off the street for tonight at least." Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, relief flooding through her so intensely her hands began to shake. "Is he saying anything?" she asked, leaning toward the phone. There was a pause, and when Cutter's voice came back, something in his tone had changed, gone careful, almost hesitant. "Yeah," he said. "He's yelling, saying somebody's going to kill him if he doesn't fix this, saying he never meant for it to go this far. The cops are just writing it off as a drunk man ranting, but..." "But what?" Lena pressed. "But it sounded like more than that to me," Cutter said quietly. "Sounded like a man who's genuinely terrified for his life. Not performing it, actually living it." The words settled over Lena strangely, an unexpected and unwelcome complexity threading through the fear and anger she'd been carrying all day. She thought of Darren's pale, shaken face after his conversation with Rhett in the office. She thought of the desperate phone call Cutter's surveillance had caught earlier, the pleading tone in his voice. She thought unbidden of Beth Sutter and wondered if Darren too had once been someone's employee. Someone caught in a trap he hadn't fully understood until it was already closing around him. It didn't excuse anything he'd done to her. It didn't erase 4 years of bruises and humiliation and careful practiced fear. But it complicated the clean narrative of villain and victim that she'd been holding on to, and something in that complication made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. Rhett returned an hour later, his expression grim but controlled, and he found Lena still sitting in the living room, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. "He's in a holding cell for tonight," Rhett confirmed, settling into the chair across from her. "Illegal weapon charge should keep him there until at least tomorrow afternoon. Gives us breathing room." "Cutter said he sounded scared," Lena said quietly. "Really scared. Not just angry that his plan didn't work." "He should be scared," Rhett said, though his voice carried less hardness than she expected. "Frank's people don't tend to forgive failure gently." "Do you think..." She hesitated, unsure how to voice the strange, uncomfortable thought that had been forming in her mind. "Do you think Darren got trapped in this the same way I did?" "Not the same, obviously. What he did to me was..." She stopped, unable to find words adequate for 4 years of cruelty. "But do you think somebody like Frank found him the way Frank's people found Beth? Found a weakness and used it?" Rhett was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Maybe," he said finally. "Cruelty and cowardice aren't the same thing, Lena, but they can live in the same man at the same time. Doesn't make what he did to you any less real. Doesn't make the bruises any less his fault. But it's possible he made one bad choice. A long time ago, took money he shouldn't have looked away from, something he shouldn't have looked away from, and got trapped deeper into it than he ever meant to go. Until the only tools he had left were fear and cruelty, because he'd already lost every better option." "That's almost worse," Lena said quietly, understanding him a little. "I wanted to just hate him clean. Simple. Instead, it's..." Complicated, Rhett finished. Yeah, most true things are. They sat with that for a moment, the quiet between them heavy but not uncomfortable, and then Rhett's phone buzzed with a message that visibly shifted his focus, his expression sharpening back into the careful, strategic attention she'd come to associate with genuine progress. What is it? She asked. My contact with state police, Rhett said, reading. Told them what we've got so far. The pattern with Talon Freight, the surveillance photos, the connection to Frank Delgado. They're interested. Say if we can bring them something concrete, tie the shell company directly to trafficking activity, they'll open a formal investigation. That's good news, isn't it? It's very good news, Rhett confirmed. But we still need that concrete evidence. Photos and patterns get their attention. They don't get a conviction. What would get a conviction? Direct evidence, Rhett said. Someone or something inside that warehouse operation willing to confirm what's actually happening there. Documentation. A witness. His eyes met hers, careful, deliberate. Or someone who worked close enough to the operation to have seen something firsthand and is willing to testify to it. The implication hung in the air between them, and Lena felt her chest tighten with a fear that was different from anything she'd felt over the past 2 days. Not fear of Darren or even fear of Frank, but the deeper, more fundamental fear of being asked to stand up in a room and speak a truth that could follow her for the rest of her life in either direction. You want me to testify? She said slowly. Not yet. Not unless it comes to that, and not unless you're ready for it. Rhett's voice was gentle but honest. But I want you to start thinking about it, because if this goes where I think it's going, there's a real chance it becomes necessary. And I won't lie to you and pretend that's a small thing to ask. Lena sat with the weight of that possibility turning it over in her mind, the image of herself in a courtroom facing down not just Darren, but potentially Frank Delgado himself, speaking aloud everything she'd spent 4 years learning to swallow and bury and survive around. If it means Beth gets justice, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. If it means no other woman ends up disappearing from that diner, or any diner like it, then yes, I'll do it. Something shifted in Rhett's expression, a mixture of pride and something softer. Something that looked almost like the particular ache of watching someone grow into strength they hadn't known they possessed. That's brave, he said quietly. Braver than you probably feel right now. I don't feel brave at all, Lena admitted. I feel terrified. Same thing most of the time, Rhett said. Bravery's not the absence of fear, Lena. It's just deciding the fear doesn't get the final word. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly on the table beside her, and she glanced down to see Marta's name flash across the screen, and something about the timing so soon after everything they'd just discussed sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her chest before she'd even opened the message. Lena, you need to see this. Found something in Darren's office. Door was open after the cops took him. I wasn't snooping. I swear I just went in to check on things, and I saw the message cut off unfinished, and Lena's hands trembled as she typed back immediately. Saw what Marta tell me. The reply took an agonizing 30 seconds to arrive, and when it did, the words on the screen made the entire room around Lena seem to fall away into silence. A ledger, names, dates, money amounts. I saw Beth's name in it, Lena, and I saw yours too. Rhett read the message over Lena's shoulder, his jaw tightening into a hard, focused line. A ledger, he said. That's exactly what we needed. That's the kind of concrete evidence that turns theories into a federal case. Marta's not safe holding on to that, Lena said, already typing back, fingers moving fast across the screen. If Frank's people find out she saw it, if they find out she's the one who told me, tell her not to touch it again, Rhett said quickly. Not to move it, not to photograph it on her personal phone, nothing that could be traced back to her directly. We need this handled clean. Lena typed the instructions with shaking hands, and Marta's reply came back almost instantly, her fear evident even through the small screen. Okay, I closed the door and I'm staying up front. But Lena, what do I do if Frank shows up? What if he comes back before you all get here? She needs protection, Lena said, looking up at Rhett with wide, urgent eyes. Right now, not in an hour. Rhett was already moving, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped, as he issued instructions to someone on the other end. Within minutes, Cutter and another man were heading out the door, and Rhett turned back to Lena with the same steady calm that had carried her through the last 2 days. We're sending people to the diner now, he said. Marta won't be alone for more than 15 minutes. And I'm calling my contact at the state police. A ledger with names, dates, and payment amounts tied directly to a location we can prove Frank Delgado visited repeatedly. That's enough to get a warrant moving tonight before anyone has a chance to destroy it. Tonight, Lena repeated the word landing with a strange mixture of relief and fresh terror. This could actually be over tonight. It could be the beginning of the end, Rhett said carefully. I don't want to promise you tonight fixes everything. These things move slow even when they move fast, but this is the break we needed. The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls and tense waiting. Lena perched on the edge of the couch, phone clutched tight in her hands, watching Rhett coordinate with a precision that spoke to years of experience she still didn't fully understand the shape of. Cutter's updates came steadily. Marta was safe, the diner secured, no sign of Frank or his people anywhere near Harris Valley. At 9:40, Rhett's phone rang, and the moment he answered, something in his posture shifted, straightening with focused intensity. Yeah, he said. Yeah, we've got it documented. Names, locations, the whole pattern. A pause, listening. Tonight works. We'll have someone escort the physical evidence to your office personally. He hung up and turned to Lena, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like genuine hope flickered across his weathered face. State police are moving on this, he said. They're sending an agent out tonight to formally take possession of the ledger, start building the case properly. This is real now, Lena. This is happening. Lena felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, 2 days of accumulated terror and exhaustion finally finding an outlet in something that felt cautiously like the beginning of relief. What about Darren, she asked. He's still in holding on the weapons charge. What happens to him now? Now that the state's involved, that changes everything for him too, Rhett said. They'll want to talk to him, see if he's willing to cooperate against Frank in exchange for a lighter sentence. Men like Darren, once they realize the organization they've been protecting isn't going to protect them back, they tend to talk fast. Do you think he will cooperate? Rhett considered the question for a long moment. I think a man who is scared enough to wave a gun around outside your apartment, scared enough to consider trying to hurt you himself, rather than face what Frank's people might do, that's a man who's already halfway to breaking. Given the right pressure, yeah, I think he talks. They didn't sleep much that night. Around midnight, a state police agent arrived at a secure meeting point Rhett had arranged, and Lena, for the first time, found herself sitting across a table from someone in a uniform recounting everything she knew in a formal recorded statement. Her voice steadier than she expected as the words finally found their way out into a space that could actually do something with them. Agent Reyes was a woman perhaps 10 years older than Lena, with sharp, attentive eyes and a manner that felt entirely different from the fear Lena had learned to associate with authority figures over the past 4 years. She listened without judgment, asked careful, precise questions, and by the time the interview concluded close to 2 a.m, Lena felt something she hadn't expected to feel at all. Believed. This is significant, Agent Reyes said, closing her notebook. The ledger combined with your testimony and the surveillance data your friends have gathered gives us a real foundation. We'll need more, but this is a strong start. Miss Harper, I want you to know whatever happens next, you did the right thing coming forward. I didn't come forward, Lena said quietly. Not really. I was scared into a corner, and somebody else did most of the work. Sometimes that's how it happens, Agent Reyes said not unkindly. Doesn't make the outcome any less important, or your courage any less real. She left with the promise of a follow-up in the coming days, and Lena sat in the quiet aftermath of the interview exhaustion, pressing down on her like a physical weight. But underneath it, something new had taken root. A fragile, unfamiliar sense that the story of her life might not be as fixed and inescapable as she'd believed for 4 long years. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Rhett's phone rang just after 7, and Lena watched his face carefully as he listened, trying to read the outcome in the small shifts of his expression before he'd said a single word. They picked up Frank Delgado overnight, he finally said, lowering the phone. State police coordinated with 2 other counties. Simultaneous raids on the warehouse, the motel outside Bakerstown, and the trucking depot near the state line. They got him! Lena's voice came out barely above a whisper, disbelief threading through every syllable. They got him, and 3 others working directly under him, found evidence at the warehouse matching everything in the ledger records, more names, and... Rhett paused, his expression growing more serious. They found evidence connecting to Beth Sutter specifically, a partial paper trail showing payment to Darren around the time she disappeared. Lena's breath caught at the confirmation of what she'd suspected for 2 years, landing with a complicated weight of vindication and grief. Is she? Lena couldn't finish. The question couldn't make herself ask it directly. They don't know yet, Rhett said gently. The ledger shows payment shows she was moved through the network, but it doesn't confirm what happened to her after that. State police are treating it as an active missing persons case, now tied directly to the trafficking investigation. They're going to look for her, Lena, really look with real resources behind it for the first time in 2 years. It wasn't the closure Lena had hoped for. Not the clean, definitive answer that would let Beth's disappearance finally rest. But it was more than 2 years of silence had ever offered, and Lena found herself gripping that small, imperfect hope with both hands, unwilling to let it slip away. What about Darren? She asked. Is he cooperating? According to my contact, he's talking, Rhett said. Talking a lot, actually. Once he realized the state was involved and Frank was already in custody, all that fear he'd been carrying turned into something else pretty fast. Self-preservation. He's naming names, describing the whole operation, everything he knows about how Frank recruited business owners, how the network moved people through. Does that mean he gets away with what he did to me? To Beth? No, Rhett said firmly. Cooperation might reduce his sentence on the trafficking charges. It doesn't erase the charges against him directly for what he did to you. Assault, threats, obstruction. Those charges stand on their own, separate from whatever deal he cuts on the larger case. He's not walking away from this a free man, Lena. Not even close. She sat with that for a long moment, feeling the strange, complicated weight of a justice that wasn't perfectly clean. Wasn't the simple villain's downfall she might have imagined in the darkest moments of her 4 years at that diner, but was perhaps exactly the kind of justice the real world actually offered, messy, partial, but real. The days that followed moved quickly, each one bringing new developments that Lena absorbed with a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. The state police investigation expanded rapidly while uncovering additional victims across the 3-county network, additional business owners who had been complicit in varying degrees, and a picture of an operation far larger and more entrenched than anyone in Harris Valley had ever suspected lived quietly among them. Marta, it turned out, had more courage in her than Lena had ever fully appreciated. She gave her own statement to investigators, corroborating patterns she'd noticed over the years, without ever fully understanding what she was seeing. Cash deliveries at strange hours, Darren's tension. Whenever Beth's name came up, small details that on their own meant nothing but together helped tighten the case considerably. I should have said something sooner, Marta told Lena during a quiet phone call 4 days after the raids. I saw things too. I just told myself it wasn't my business. You're saying something now, Lena said. That matters more than when you started. It was a lesson Lena was still learning herself, still turning over in her mind during the quiet hours at Rhett's ranch house where she remained while the investigation unfolded and her own safety was assessed and reassessed by people far more experienced in these matters than she was. The lesson that silence, however protective it felt in the moment, was rarely as safe as it pretended to be. That speaking, however terrifying, was sometimes the only path that led anywhere but deeper into the same trap. A week after the raids, Rhett found her sitting on the back porch in the late afternoon light, staring out at the tree line the way she had that first terrible day, though something in her posture now carried less weight than it had then. Got some news, he said, settling into the chair beside her. Thought you should hear it from me first. Lena's stomach tightened automatically. 4 years of conditioning, still whispering that news. Any news usually meant something bad. They found her, Rhett said quietly. Beth. Lena's breath caught and she turned to face him, fully searching his expression for the answer before he could give her the words. She's alive, Rhett continued, and Lena felt something break open in her chest, a sob rising up before she could stop it. Found her at a facility 2 states over, part of the network's operation. She's been through hell, Lena, 2 years of it, but she's alive and she's safe now, and she's already talking to investigators. She's alive, Lena repeated the words, feeling almost too large to hold, tears streaming freely down her face now. 2 years and she's alive. She asked about you actually, Rhett said gently. When they told her the case broke open because of a waitress at the same diner who wouldn't stop asking questions. She remembered you, said you were kind to her back when you both worked there. Said she always wondered if anybody noticed when she disappeared. I did notice, Lena said, voice thick with emotion. I just didn't know what to do about it. I was too scared. You did something about it eventually, Red said. That's what matters. That's what got her found. They sat together in the fading afternoon light, and for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, Lena allowed herself to simply feel the relief of it, unclouded by fear or exhaustion, or the constant grinding vigilance that had defined her existence for so long. Beth was alive. The network was breaking apart piece by piece, name by name. And she, Lena Harper, who had spent 4 years believing herself powerless, invisible, replaceable, had been part of the reason why. The weeks that followed brought their own challenges. There were more interviews, more careful, detailed statements given to investigators, building what was rapidly becoming one of the largest trafficking cases the region had seen in years. There were nights when the fear resurfaced unexpectedly, when Lena would wake from nightmares about warehouses and ledgers and Darren's hand around her wrist, and Rhett, or one of his crew, would be there patient and steady, reminding her that the danger, for now at least, had passed. Darren's case moved through the system with the particular slowness of legal proceedings, but the outcome, when it finally arrived nearly 2 months later, brought Lena a measure of closure she hadn't fully expected to feel. He pleaded guilty to charges of assault, criminal threats, and facilitating human trafficking, accepting a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the better part of 2 decades. His cooperation with prosecutors against Frank Delgado's larger network had reduced his sentence somewhat, but it hadn't erased the fundamental reckoning of what he'd done to Beth, to Lena, to every vulnerable person who had ever walked through the doors of Cole's Diner, believing they had no other options. Frank Delgado's case was larger, more complex, stretching across multiple jurisdictions and involving dozens of additional charges as investigators continued to uncover the full scope of his operation. Lena wasn't required to testify in that case, her role having been primarily in providing the initial thread that unraveled the whole conspiracy, but she followed its progress from a careful distance, taking quiet satisfaction in each new arrest, each new piece of the network dismantled. It was nearly 3 months after that first day, when the motorcycles had rolled into the diner's gravel lot, filling the air with thunder and changing the entire trajectory of Lena's life, that she finally returned to Harris Valley. Not to Cole's Diner, which had closed permanently once its connection to the trafficking network became public knowledge, but to the town itself, to the small apartment she'd once called home, now feeling different, lighter. No longer haunted by the specific dread that had once accompanied every drive back from a shift. She'd taken a new job by then, waitressing at a small family-owned restaurant 2 towns over, a place with an owner who smiled at his employees because he meant it, who asked about their days because he actually wanted to know the answers. It wasn't a grand transformation, not the kind of dramatic reinvention that made for tidy endings. It was smaller than that, quieter, but no less significant for its modesty, a woman learning slowly and carefully what it felt like to work somewhere without flinching every time a door opened. Rhett found her there one afternoon nearly 4 months after everything had begun, sliding into a booth near the window, with the same unhurried presence she remembered from that very first day. "Heard you were doing well," he said as she approached with her order pad, though this time her smile, when it came, reached all the way to her eyes. "I'm doing okay," she said. "Better than okay some days." "That's good to hear." He studied her for a moment, the same careful attention she remembered, though the weight behind it had changed, softened into something that looked unmistakably like genuine warmth. "Beth's doing better too. Thought you'd want to know. She's staying with family now, working through everything with good people helping her along the way." "I'm glad," Lena said, meaning it fully. "I think about her a lot. Wonder if I'll ever get to actually talk to her again." "She mentioned wanting to reach out once she's ready," Rhett said. "These things take time, but the door's open whenever she gets there." Lena nodded, sitting down across from him, without being asked, something she never would have done with a customer 4 months ago, back when every interaction had been carefully measured, carefully controlled by fear of consequences that no longer shaped her days the way they once had. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "That night you told me about Carol, the woman you didn't help back before all this started for Hugo. Do you think about her a lot?" Rhett's expression grew thoughtful, something old and weathered moving behind his pale eyes. "Every single day," he said, honestly. "I think about her every time I meet somebody who reminds me of her. Every time I see somebody flinch the way she used to flinch." He paused. "I thought about her a lot when I first walked into that diner and saw you." "Is that why you helped me? Because I reminded you of her?" "Partly, maybe, at first. He considered his words carefully. But it stopped being about Carol pretty quick, Lena. It became about you, about what you deserved and what you were capable of once somebody finally believed you deserved better than what you'd settled for. Lena felt something warm and unfamiliar move through her chest at those words, a recognition that she was being seen not as a project or a debt being repaid, but as a person whose own strength had ultimately carried her through the hardest chapter of her life. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you," she said, "for all of it, for noticing that first day, for not walking away when it would have been so much easier." "You don't owe me thanks," Rhett said. "You did the hard part. I just made sure you didn't have to do it completely alone." They sat together for a while longer, conversation drifting easily between them in a way that surprised her with its comfort, its lack of the careful, guarded distance she'd maintained with nearly everyone in her life for the past 4 years. When he finally rose to leave, dropping bills on the table that once again exceeded the cost of his meal by a considerable margin, he paused at the door and turned back to her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't fix your life, Lena. I want you to understand that clearly. Everything you have built since then, this job, this version of yourself that isn't afraid to sit down across from somebody and ask hard questions, that's all yours. I just made sure you could finally see what was possible once the fear stopped controlling every choice you made." "That's a kind way of putting it," Lena said, "but I think you're underselling what you actually did." "Maybe," Rhett said, a small, rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Or maybe I'm just telling you the truth. You were never as small as you thought you were back in that diner. You just needed somebody to help you remember that." He left, then the bell above the door of the small restaurant ringing softly behind him, and Lena stood at the window watching him swing a leg over his motorcycle. The same unhurried confidence she remembered from that very first day, and she felt watching him ride away down the road, a profound and settled gratitude that had nothing left in it of the desperate, fragile hope she'd carried during those terrifying 48 hours months before. She thought standing there of everything the past 4 months had taught her that silence, however protective it felt, was never truly safety, only a slower kind of harm. That the people who claimed power over you through fear and humiliation were in the end almost always smaller and more frightened than they appeared, men building fragile fortresses out of other people's suffering because they had nothing sturdier to construct their own worth from. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway, one small choice at a time until those choices accumulated into something that finally looked like freedom. She thought of Beth Sutter alive and healing 2 states away, finally free of an ordeal that had stretched far longer and far darker than Lena's own suffering, but no longer alone in it, no longer forgotten, no longer erased. She thought of Marta, who had found her own courage in the aftermath, speaking truth she'd swallowed for years, because somebody else had finally shown her that speaking was possible. She thought of Darren Cole sitting now in a cell that would hold him for the better part of 2 decades, a man who had built his entire identity on the control and suffering of others, only to discover in the end that such foundations always eventually collapse. And she thought of herself 4 months ago, kneeling on a diner floor, gathering broken plates, while a man screamed at her for a mistake that wasn't hers, believing with her whole exhausted heart that this was simply what her life was destined to be. A slow, grinding erosion of everything she might have become, dressed up in the acceptable language of just keeping a job, just surviving another day. That woman felt distant to her now. Not gone entirely, she still lived somewhere inside. Lena still surfaced in quiet moments of doubt or fear, still whispered occasionally that safety meant staying small, staying quiet, staying invisible. But she no longer had the final word. She no longer got to write the whole story. Lena Harper stood in the window of a restaurant where nobody screamed at her, where nobody made her feel replaceable, where every day she got to practice in small and steady increments what it meant to take up space in her own life without fear of what that space might cost her. She turned away from the window and walked back toward the counter, back toward customers waiting for their coffee refilled, back toward a life that was in every meaningful way entirely her own, now chosen rather than endured, built rather than merely survived. Outside, the sound of Rhett's motorcycle faded into the distance, swallowed up by the ordinary noise of an ordinary afternoon, and Lena Harper no longer hiding bruises behind a practiced smile, no longer flinching at the sound of a raised voice, no longer measuring every word before she dared to speak. It picked up her order pad and moved through her shift exactly the way she wanted to, not as someone surviving, as someone finally and completely deciding